The sky was the color of old iron, a heavy, unyielding gray that seemed to press down upon the tops of the pine trees, flattening the world into a singular, two-dimensional plane of cold. There was no sun, only a vague, diffused luminescence that suggested the day was ending, though it felt as if it had never truly begun. The light was weak, filtering through layers of atmospheric ice and high, thin clouds that stretched across the horizon like bands of torn linen. It was a light without warmth, a pale wash of charcoal and slate that drained the color from the landscape, leaving behind only the deep, monochromatic tones of a winter that had lasted for centuries. Here, on the King's Road, the snow did not fall so much as it materialized from the air itself. It was a fine, dry powder, the kind that did not clump or stick, but rather flowed like sand, drifting across the hardened ruts of the path in mesmerizing, serpentine patterns. The wind was a constant, low moan, a sound that vibrated in the bones of the earth, pushing the snow into drifts that leaned against the trunks of the ancient firs. The trees themselves stood like sentinels of the void, their branches heavy with white burdens, their needles dark and sharp, sketched against the gloom in strokes of deep forest green and midnight blue. They did not sway, for the cold had frozen the sap within them, turning wood into stone, locking the forest into a sculpture of silence. A single figure moved through the stillness, a small, dark smudge against the endless pale expanse. It was the royal messenger, though there was no grandeur in his appearance, no gold braid or bright scarlet tunic to announce his station. He was wrapped in layers of rough, gray wool, a cloak that had been mended a dozen times, heavy and stiff with frost. The wool smelled of wet sheep and wood smoke, a scent that was slowly being scrubbed away by the sterile, metallic odor of the snow. He sat slumped in the saddle, his posture shaped by the miles, a curve of exhaustion that matched the arch of the horse's neck. The horse, a large, shaggy beast of roan and shadow, plodded forward with a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. Crunch, step, breath. Crunch, step, breath. The sound of the hooves breaking through the crust of the snow was the only clock that mattered. It was a dull, muffled thud, swallowed instantly by the vast acoustic dampening of the forest. The snow absorbed all noise, stealing the echo before it could be born. The messenger could hear the creak of the leather saddle, the friction of the stirrup leathers against his boots, and the heavy, laboring lungs of the horse. Great plumes of steam erupted from the animal's nostrils with every exhalation, billowing out like white smoke before vanishing into the biting air. The steam coated the horse's muzzle in a delicate lattice of frost, turning the dark hairs white, a mask of ice that grew thicker with every mile. The messenger's own breath caught in his scarf, a rough loop of knit yarn pulled up over his nose. The moisture from his mouth had frozen the wool into a hard, solid shell, a cage of ice that rubbed against his chin. He did not reach up to adjust it. His hands were buried deep within thick mittens of boiled leather and fur, resting heavily on the pommel of the saddle. To move them would be to invite the cold in, to break the fragile seal of warmth that he had managed to preserve around his fingers. He could feel the reins, stiff and unyielding, looped loosely through his grip. There was no need to guide the horse. The beast knew the road, or perhaps it simply knew that to stop was to die, and so it continued forward, one heavy hoof after the other, following the narrow corridor of white that cut through the dark trees. The visual landscape was a study in shadow and texture, a drawing rendered in soft pastels on black paper. The shadows were not black, but a deep, bruised purple, pooling in the hollows of the drifts and beneath the overhang of the branches. The snow itself was not pure white, but a spectrum of grays and blues, reflecting the somber mood of the sky. Where the wind had scoured the snow away, patches of dark ice gleamed like obsidian, reflecting the faint, dying light of the sky. The texture of the world was rough and granular. The bark of the trees was deeply furrowed, ridges of shadow and light that looked like the skin of some ancient, slumbering reptile. The messenger's cloak was a landscape of its own, the coarse weave of the fabric catching the tiny crystals of falling snow, holding them like precious stones until they too became part of the garment. He carried the weight of the kingdom in a leather satchel slung across his back beneath the cloak. The leather was old, cracked and worn smooth at the corners, stained with the oil of 1,000 hands and the weather of 1,000 storms. Inside were parchments sealed with wax, red and gold, brittle in the cold. Words of law, words of command, lists of taxes, and decrees of war. They meant nothing here. In this cathedral of ice, the edicts of kings were less than the whisper of the wind in the pines. The ink was frozen on the page. The wax was hard as stone. The messages were merely ballast, a physical weight that kept the writer tethered to the earth, preventing him from dissolving into the gray mist that swirled around him. The cold was not merely a temperature, it was a presence. It was a physical entity that sought to enter every gap in his clothing, every seam, every buttonhole. It pressed against his eyes, making them water, and then froze the tears on his lashes, blurring his vision until the world became a soft, indistinct smear of shapes. He blinked slowly, clearing the ice for a moment, only to have it return. He watched the back of the horse's head, the rhythmic bobbing of the ears, one flickering back occasionally to catch the sound of the wind, then swiveling forward again. The mane was stiff, tangled with burrs that were now encased in crystal, hanging like wind chimes that made no sound. Time had lost its structure. There were no hours, only the gradient of the light. The gray of the sky was deepening, shifting from the color of iron to the color of slate, and then to the deep, resonant blue of a bruised plum. The horizon was vanishing, the line between earth and sky erased by the falling snow. The trees seemed to be stepping closer to the road, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, draped in tattered sleeves of white lace. The silence grew heavier as the light faded. It was a silence that had weight, pressing against the eardrums, a roaring quiet that amplified the sound of the blood rushing in the messenger's own ears. He focused on the sensation of his boots in the stirrups. His feet were numb, distant blocks of wood that he could no longer feel, yet he knew they were there by the pressure on his ankles. The cold had worked its way through the leather, through the wool socks, seeking the bone. He wiggled his toes, a microscopic movement that sent a dull, phantom ache up his shins. It was a good pain. It meant the nerves were still alive, still fighting the encroaching numbness. He shifted his weight in the saddle, the leather groaning in protest, a sound that seemed shockingly loud in the stillness. The horse stumbled slightly, a hoof catching on a hidden root or a patch of ice, but recovered instantly, finding its rhythm again without breaking stride. Crunch, step, breath. The road began to climb, a gentle, agonizing slope that wound its way up the side of a ridge. The trees thinned slightly here, exposing the traveler to the full force of the wind. It came from the north, a steady, relentless push that carried needles of ice, scouring the exposed skin of the messenger's face. He ducked his head, burying his chin deeper into the frozen scarf, pulling the hood of his cloak forward until it formed a tunnel of wool around his vision. Inside this tunnel, the world was dark and narrow, focused solely on the patch of snow immediately in front of the horse's hooves. He watched the ground pass beneath him, a mesmerizing scroll of white and gray. He saw the tracks of a hare, already half filled with fresh snow, a fleeting record of life in a lifeless land. He saw the fallen branch of a pine, shattered by the weight of the ice, its wood pale and raw against the dark bark. The visual style of the world remained soft, hazy, as if viewed through a heavy pane of old glass. The sharp edges of reality were filed down by the twilight. The blue tones deepened, becoming rich and velvety. The snow took on a luminescence of its own, glowing faintly with the last captured particles of daylight. It was the blue hour, that suspended moment between day and night when the world holds its breath. The messenger felt the change in the air. The temperature dropped, a subtle sharpening of the cold that pierced through the layers of wool. The wind shifted, swirling the snow into small, ghostly dervishes that danced across the road and vanished into the trees. He thought of the fire he hoped to find. He did not think of it with excitement, but with a dull, necessary craving like the need for air. He pictured the color of the flame, a warm, dirty orange contrasting with the clean, sterile blue of the outside world. He imagined the smell of burning peat, the crackle of dry wood. But the image was distant, a dream that belonged to another life. For now there was only the ride, the eternal, repetitive motion of the horse, the sway of the saddle, the friction of wool on wool. The forest grew denser as the road crested the ridge and began to descend into a valley. Here, the ancient firs were massive, their trunks as wide as towers, their canopy blocking out the sky completely. The darkness under the trees was absolute, save for the faint, reflected glow of the snow. The messenger felt as if he were entering a cavern, a subterranean world of roots and ice. The wind was cut off by the wall of trees, leaving behind a stillness that was even profounder than before. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine resin and cold decay. The sound of the hooves changed, becoming deeper, more hollow, as the snow grew softer and deeper in the shelter of the woods. He closed his eyes for a moment, trusting the horse. The darkness behind his eyelids was filled with swirling patterns of light, the afterimage of the snow. He felt the sway of the beast, a gentle rocking that threatened to lull him into a sleep from which he would not wake. The cold was a narcotic, slowing his heart, slowing his thoughts. It whispered to him that it would be easy to stop, to slide from the saddle and lie down in the soft, welcoming drift, to let the snow cover him like a blanket. To become part of the sculpture. He forced his eyes open, the lids heavy and stiff. He fixed his gaze on the back of the horse's neck, on the coarse hairs that stood up in the cold. He counted the steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. The numbers were meaningless, but they gave his mind a shape to hold onto. He counted to 100, then started again. He counted the trees as they passed, dark pillars of shadow. He counted the breaths of the horse, watching the steam rise and vanish. The repetition was a rhythm, a mantra of survival. It anchored him in the present, preventing his mind from drifting away into the numb void. As the road wound deeper into the valley, the texture of the surroundings became more intricate. The undergrowth was a tangle of briars and frozen ferns, sketched in fine, frantic lines against the smooth background of the snow. The thorns were encased in clear ice, glinting like glass in the gloom. A frozen stream paralleled the road, a ribbon of black ice that wound through the trees, silent and still. The water was trapped beneath a thick slab of crystal, but in places the ice had cracked, revealing the dark, moving liquid below, a vein of black blood pulsing through the white body of the land. The messenger shifted his grip on the reins, his leather mittens creaking. He felt the fatigue in his shoulders, a heavy, dull ache that radiated down his spine. The mail satchel felt like it contained lead bars. The The straps dug into his collarbone, compressing the layers of wool, cutting off the circulation. He tried to shrug the weight to adjust the burden, but it was settled, a permanent part of his anatomy. He was no longer a man riding a horse. He was a component of a mechanism, a courier of silence moving through a world of ice. The light had now almost entirely failed. The world was reduced to silhouettes and shades of indigo. The lantern hanging from his saddle remained unlit. To light it would be to admit the darkness, to shrink his world down to a terrifyingly small sphere of yellow light surrounded by an infinite unknown. He preferred the gloom, the gradual adjustment of his eyes to the night. He preferred to see the shapes of the trees, the lay of the land, however dim. The lantern was for the end, for the arrival, or for the emergency that he prayed would not come. The horse slowed, its head lowering further. It was tired. The messenger could feel the change in the gait, a slight hesitation in each step, a drag of the hoof before it was placed. He leaned forward slightly, patting the horse's neck with a clumsy, mittened hand. The fur was cold, stiff with frost, but beneath it he could feel the warmth of the animal, the slow, powerful engine of muscle and blood. "Easy," he whispered, or perhaps he only thought the word. His voice was a rusted hinge, unused for days. The sound did not leave the scarf. The horse's ear flicked back, acknowledging the presence of the rider, a silent communion between two weary travelers. They passed a stone marker, half buried in the snow. It was a rough-hewn block of granite, ancient and weathered, its inscriptions eroded by centuries of wind and ice. It was a milestone marking the distance to a city that felt a lifetime away. The messenger did not look at it. He knew the road by the feel of the ground, by the shape of the darkness. He knew that the last stop was near. Not near in terms of distance, perhaps, but near in the sense that the road was leading him there, inevitable as gravity. The wind began to pick up again as they moved through a clearing, a break in the canopy where the sky revealed itself once more. It was fully night now. The clouds had thinned in patches, revealing a few faint, watery stars that looked cold and distant, hard points of light that offered no guidance. The moon was hidden, a diffuse glow behind the veil of clouds, casting a strange, pearlescent light over the snow. The shadows stretched long and distorted across the clearing, reaching out from the tree line like dark fingers grasping for the traveler. The cold intensified with the night. It settled into the valley like sediment in water, heavy and motionless. It was a cold that cracked stone and split trees. The messenger could hear the forest reacting to the drop in temperature. Every now and then a sharp crack would echo through the woods, the sound of a tree limb snapping under the tension of the frost, or the ice on the stream fracturing. The sounds were gunshots in the silence, startling and violent, yet the messenger did not flinch. He was insulated by his exhaustion, wrapped in a cocoon of wool and numbness. He focused on the texture of the saddle horn beneath his hand. The leather was freezing, sucking the heat from his palm even through the mitten. He focused on the sway of the horse, the gentle pitch and roll that was the only motion in a static world. He focused on the air entering his nose, sharp and metallic, freezing the hairs, chilling the back of his throat. He was a creature of sensation, living entirely in the immediate physical reality of the winter. Past and future had dissolved. There was only the snow, the dark, and the road. The horse's breathing was louder now, a rhythmic rasping that spoke of limits being reached. The steam from its nostrils was thicker, a dense fog that momentarily obscured the view ahead before being torn away by the wind. The messenger knew they had to stop soon, not at the destination, but to rest, to breathe. But to stop in the open was death. They had to keep moving, to keep the blood flowing, to keep the heat engine running. The paradox of the journey, To stop is to recover, but to stop is to freeze. So they moved on, a slow, stubborn procession of two against the elements. The darkness was a heavy medium like ink. The visual style of the scene shifted to deep, saturated blacks and navy blues, with the white of the snow providing the only contrast. The trees were no longer green. They were jagged shapes of void cut out of the dark sky. The lantern on the saddle swung gently, a dark pendulum counting the seconds of the night. The metal was cold, covered in a thin rime of frost. The glass was dark. Far ahead, or perhaps it was a trick of the mind, the messenger thought he saw a change in the texture of the dark, a straightening of the lines. The chaos of the forest giving way to the order of a clearing, the suggestion of a structure. It was not a light, not yet. It was a density in the shadows, a block of geometric blackness against the organic shapes of the trees. He stared at it, his eyes watering, his lashes freezing together. He did not speed up. The horse did not speed up. They maintained their slow, funereal pace, approaching the unknown shape with the inevitability of the tide. The wind sighed through the upper branches, a long, mournful exhalation that sounded like a voice speaking a language long dead. The snow hissed as it drifted across the road. The cold tightened its grip, squeezing the world, squeezing the messenger, compressing him into a small, dense point of consciousness. He was just a rider. He was just a messenger. He was just a shadow moving through the long, dark night. And the road stretched on, a pale scar on the face of the sleeping world. The shape in the darkness did not move. It was a block of solid shadow, darker than the trees, darker than the space between the stars. It sat heavy on the side of the road, a geometric intrusion into the organic chaos of the forest. As the horse plodded closer, the vague outline resolved into the hard, straight lines of a structure. It was a low building, squat and broad, hunkered down against the earth as if trying to merge with the stone beneath it. The roof was steep, a sharp triangle of white interrupting the gloom, burdened with a thick, undulating blanket of snow that hung over the eaves like a heavy brow. The visual definition of the scene remained soft, a sketch in charcoal and indigo. The building was drawn with heavy, deliberate strokes, the logs of the walls rendered in deep browns and blacks that swallowed the faint ambient light. There were no windows, or if there were, they were shuttered tight, sealed against the night. No light spilled from within. No smoke rose from the chimney, which stood like a broken finger against the sky. The chimney was capped with a mound of snow, a white plug that suggested a cold hearth, a silence where there should be the roar of a fire. The messenger stared at it, his eyes tracing the line of the roof, the heavy overhang of the eaves where icicles hung like iron spikes, long and sharp and deadly. The horse stopped. It did not need a command. It simply ceased its forward motion, the rhythm of the journey coming to a sudden, jarring halt. The silence that followed was immediate and crushing. The sound of the hooves, the crunch of the snow, the creak of the tack all vanished, leaving only the sound of the wind hissing through the pine needles and the heavy, laboring breath of the animal. The steam from the horse's nostrils rose in thick, white columns, drifting up toward the dark eaves before dissipating into the cold air. The messenger sat motionless in the saddle. The cessation of movement was disorienting. His body, tuned to the constant sway and jolt of the ride, felt a phantom motion, a vertigo that made the world seem to tilt slowly on its axis. He looked at the door. It was a slab of rough-hewn oak, dark and formidable, bound with straps of iron that had rusted to the color of dried blood. The wood was scarred and weathered, the grain raised by years of wind and ice, a tactile map of the storms that had battered it. Drifted snow was piled against the bottom of the door, a white wedge that locked it to the threshold. It looked as though it had not been opened in days, perhaps weeks. The messenger felt a dull pang of dread, a cold weight in his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. A cold hearth meant work. A cold hearth meant that the sanctuary was just another kind of tomb, one that he would have to warm with his own fading energy. He had to dismount. The thought was simple, but the execution was a monumental task. His legs were encased in the stiff, frozen wool of his trousers, the muscles cold and unresponsive. He tried to wiggle his toes inside his boots, but there was only a distant, dull pressure, no sharp sensation of movement. He took a breath, the air tasting of ice and old iron, and shifted his weight. The saddle leather groaned, a loud, protesting creak that seemed to echo in the clearing. He gripped the pommel with his left hand, the mitten slipping slightly on the frosted leather before finding purchase. Slowly, agonizingly, he swung his right leg over the back of the horse. The movement was stiff, a robotic articulation of a joint that had forgotten how to bend. His boots scraped against the saddlebags, a rough, scratching sound. He felt the pull of gravity, a heavy hand dragging him down. He slid from the saddle, his body dropping like a stone. His feet hit the ground with a thud that jarred his teeth, sending a shockwave up his spine. His knees buckled, weak and trembling, refusing to hold his weight for a second before locking into place. He grabbed the stirrup leather to steady himself, leaning against the warm, heaving flank of the horse. He stood there for a long time, breathing. The ground was hard beneath the snow, uneven and treacherous. The snow came up to his shins, burying his boots, pressing its cold weight against his legs. He felt the immense towering height of the trees around him, the way they leaned in, watching. The building stood before him, silent and indifferent. It was the last stop. A way station for the king's messengers, a place of stored wood and dry hay, a shelter maintained by the crown for the thin line of communication that held the realm together. But it looked abandoned, a husk left behind by a retreating civilization. The messenger turned his attention to the horse. He could not leave the beast standing in the open. The wind was picking up, swirling the loose powder around the horse's legs, coating its shaggy coat in a fresh layer of white. He reached for the bridle, his fingers clumsy in the thick mittens. The leather was stiff as wood, resisting his attempts to manipulate the buckle. He had to take his mittens off. The thought was terrifying. To expose his skin to the air was to invite the frostbite that hovered at the edges of his sensation. But he had no choice. He pulled the mitten from his right hand, holding it under his left arm. His hand was pale, the skin waxy and translucent in the gloom. The knuckles were red and swollen. The air bit into his flesh instantly, a sharp, stinging pain that felt like a burn. He worked quickly, his fingers fumbling with the cold metal of the buckle. The metal stuck to his skin, a magnetic cold that threatened to tear the flesh if he wasn't careful. He freed the bit, allowing the horse to lower its head. He kept the halter on, clipping a lead rope to the iron ring. He put the mitten back on, shoving his hand deep into the fur, squeezing his fingers into a fist to recapture the fleeing warmth. He led the horse toward a lean-to attached to the side of the cabin. It was a simple structure, a roof extending from the main wall supported by two rough posts. It offered shelter from the wind and the falling snow, though it was open to the cold. The ground under the lean-to was packed earth, dry and hard. He tied the horse to a sturdy rail, the knot simple and practiced, done by feel rather than sight. The horse let out a long, shuddering sigh and shook its coat, a ripple of movement that dislodged a cascade of snow from its back. The messenger patted the animal's neck, the coarse hair rough against his mitten. He could feel the heat radiating from the beast, a precious, living warmth that he was reluctant to leave. He returned to the saddle to retrieve the satchel. The leather bags were heavy, stiff with cold. He unbuckled them, the straps fighting him every inch of the way. He hauled the satchel over his shoulder, the weight settling familiarly against his back. It was a burden he could not set down, not until the messages were delivered or he was dead. He also unstrapped a smaller bundle, his bedroll and a small sack of oats for the horse. He left the oats in the manger, pouring them out into a wooden trough that was worn smooth by generations of hungry mouths. The sound of the oats hitting the wood was dry and hollow, like rain on a coffin. Now the cabin. He walked back to the front door, his footsteps heavy and dragging. The snow crunched loudly in the silence. He stood before the door, looking at the iron latch. It was a simple thumb latch, heavy and crude. He reached out and pressed his thumb against the lever. It did not move. It was frozen solid, fused by ice that had melted and refrozen in the mechanism. He pressed harder, leaning his weight into it. The iron bit into his mitten, but the latch remained immovable. He stepped back and looked at the door frame. Ice had formed along the edges, sealing the wood to the jamb. A thick, opaque line of white mortar that held the door fast. He would have to break the seal. He raised his booted foot and kicked the base of the door. The sound was a dull, wooden thud that vibrated through his leg but did nothing to the door. He kicked again, harder. A crack of ice fracturing echoed in the clearing. He kicked a third time, aiming for the spot where the lock engaged. A sheet of ice flaked off the wood and fell to the snow, shattering into diamond dust. He tried the latch again. He gripped the handle with both hands and jerked it upward. There was a screech of metal on metal, a high-pitched protest, and the lever gave way. The door popped open an inch, breaking the vacuum of the interior. A smell drifted out, the scent of stale, frigid air, of old soot, of dry rot and dust. It was the smell of a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time. He put his shoulder to the wood and pushed. The hinges screamed, a sound of grinding rust that tore through the quiet night. The door swung inward, dragging a fan of snow across the floorboards. The messenger stumbled into the darkness, the momentum carrying him over the threshold. He stopped and stood just inside the door, letting his eyes adjust. It was darker inside than out. The snow outside reflected the ambient starlight, creating a gray luminescence. Inside, there was nothing. It was a void. He turned and pushed the door shut. It required a significant effort to force it back against the drift that had formed on the threshold, but eventually it slammed home with a heavy, final thud. He threw the bolt, sliding the iron bar into place. The sound of the wind was instantly cut off, replaced by a profound, ringing silence. The air inside was still, dead calm, and intensely cold. It was a different kind of cold than the outside. The outside cold was active, sharp, driven by the wind. The inside cold was passive, heavy, a stagnant weight that settled on the skin like a damp cloth. He reached into his pocket, his fingers searching for the small tin box he carried. Matches. He had to be careful. His hands were shaking, a fine, uncontrollable tremor caused by the fatigue and the drop in adrenaline. He pulled the box out and rattled it. The sound was comforting, the rattle of potential fire. He moved forward into the room, shuffling his feet to avoid tripping over unseen obstacles. He knew the layout of these way stations. They were all the same. A single room, a stone hearth on one wall, a table, a bench, a bunk in the corner. He found the table by bumping into it with his hip. The wood was rough, unfinished. He set the tin box down and felt across the surface for the lantern that should be there. His hand brushed against something cold and glass, a chimney of an oil lamp. He felt for the base, finding the reservoir. He shook it gently. It was light, almost empty, but there was a faint slosh of liquid at the bottom. Oil. Thick, congealed oil, but it was fuel. He opened the matchbox. He took out a single match, holding it delicately between his thumb and forefinger. He struck it against the side of the box. A spark flared, then died. The phosphorus was damp, or the striking surface was too worn. He cursed silently, a thought rather than a sound. He tried again. This time the match flared with a hiss, a small, sudden point of yellow light in the overwhelming black. The flame was tiny, fragile, trembling in the still air. It cast long, distorted shadows that leaped up the walls like startled ghosts. He touched the flame to the wick of the lamp. The wick was black and crusted with carbon. It sputtered, resisting the heat, then caught. A small blue flame circled the wick, growing slowly into a yellow tongue. He lowered the glass chimney. The light steadied, pushing back the darkness, revealing the room in a wash of sepia and gold. The visual style shifted to the interior perspective. The walls were logs, chinked with moss and mud. The texture was incredibly detailed, the grain of the wood, the cracks in the mud, the cobwebs that hung in the corners, heavy with dust, looking like gray lace. The floor was made of wide planks, worn smooth in the center and rough at the edges. The light from the lamp was weak, barely reaching the corners of the room, creating a vignette effect where the edges of the vision blurred into shadow. The messenger looked around. The room was empty of life. There was the table, a heavy thing of oak, a bench overturned on the floor, a bunk built into the wall filled with straw that looked matted and old, and the fireplace. It was a massive structure of river stone taking up the entire far wall. The stones were cold, gray, and lifeless. The mouth of the hearth was a black maw, filled with the ashes of a fire that had burned out long ago. There was no wood stack beside it. The wood box was empty, save for a few scraps of bark and dust. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. No wood. The previous occupant had burned it all and left none for the next. Or perhaps there had been no previous occupant for a season, and the supplies had simply run out. He stared at the empty box, his mind processing the information slowly. He was inside, out of the wind, but without fire. The shelter was just a coffin. The temperature inside would drop until it matched the outside. He would freeze in the dark. He looked at the lamp. The oil was low. It would burn for an hour, maybe two. Then the dark would return. He needed fuel. He needed to feed the hearth. He looked around the room again, searching for anything burnable. The overturned bench, the straw in the bunk, the loose floorboards. He was too tired to go back outside, to search the linta for a woodshed that might be buried under snow. He had to make do with what was here. He moved toward the hearth, his boots loud on the floorboards. He knelt before the ashes, the movement causing his knees to crack. He reached out and touched the stone. It was ice cold, sucking the heat from his hand. He pulled his mitten off again and dug into the ashes, feeling for any lingering warmth. There was none. The ash was fine and gritty, coating his skin in gray dust. It was completely dead. He stood up, the room spinning slightly. He walked to the bunk and grabbed a handful of straw. It was dry, brittle. It would burn fast and hot, a flash in the pan, but it would be a start. He carried it to the fireplace and piled it on the grate. He went back for more, stripping the bunk until he had a mound of yellow straw in the black mouth of the hearth. Next, the bench. He righted it. It was solid, heavy. He couldn't break it with his hands. He looked for a tool. In the corner, leaning against the wall, was an axe. The handle was gray with age, the head rusted. He picked it up. The weight was familiar, comforting. He dragged the bench to the center of the room. He raised the axe, the movement stretching his stiff shoulders. He brought it down, thwack. The sound was dull, absorbed by the wood. The blade bit deep, but the wood did not split. It was tough, seasoned oak. He struck again and again, the rhythm of the chopping replacing the rhythm of the ride. Chip by chip, splinter by splinter, he began to dismantle the furniture. It was slow work. The room was cold, his breath pluming in the lamp light. The shadows danced on the walls, mimicking his movements, a dark pantomime of labor. He created a pile of splinters, of broken legs and shattered planks. It was a meager pile, barely enough to warm the stones, let alone the room. But it was something. It was a defiance against the cold. He carried the wood to the hearth, arranging it carefully over the straw. He built a small pyramid, a structure of hope. He placed the smallest chips at the bottom, the larger pieces on top. He took the lamp and carried it to the fireplace. He removed the glass chimney, careful not to burn his fingers. He tilted the lamp, letting a few drops of precious oil fall onto the straw. Then he touched the flame of the lamp to the oil-soaked grass. It caught instantly. A whoosh of yellow flame erupted, licking up the sides of the wood. The straw crackled, a sharp, aggressive sound in the quiet room. The smoke rose, gray and acrid, drawn up the chimney by the draft. The messenger watched the fire, his eyes wide, reflecting the growing light. He sat back on his heels, his hands extended toward the warmth. It was a tiny fire, a fragile thing, but it was alive. It was a seed of heat in a world of ice. He watched the wood catch. The oak was slow to burn, resisting the flame, but eventually the edges began to glow red. A small bed of coals began to form. The light in the room changed, shifting from the steady, pale yellow of the lamp to the flickering, warm orange of the fire. The shadows on the walls began to dance more wildly, leaping and twisting with the flames. The messenger felt a profound exhaustion settle over him. The adrenaline of the arrival was fading, leaving behind a body that was battered and empty. He wanted to sleep. He wanted to curl up on the floor in front of the fire and close his eyes, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. The fire needed tending. It was a newborn, demanding and weak. If he slept now, it would die, and he would die with it. He looked at the remaining pieces of the bench. It wasn't enough. He would need more wood. He looked at the table. He looked at the bunk frame. He looked at the floorboards. The room was not a shelter. It was fuel. He would have to burn the station to survive the night. He would have to consume the very thing that protected him. He sat there, the firelight illuminating his face, revealing the lines of fatigue, the frostnip on his cheeks, the weariness in his eyes. He was a statue of wool and leather, animated only by the slow rise and fall of his chest. The silence of the room was filled with the crackle of the fire and the wind outside, which had begun to howl, a low, mournful sound that tore at the corners of the cabin. The storm was worsening. The temperature was dropping, and the night had only just begun. He stared into the flames, losing himself in the movement of the light. The orange tongues licked at the wood, consuming it, turning matter into heat. It was a simple, ancient equation, sacrifice for survival. He reached out and added another piece of wood to the fire, placing it with the precision of a jeweler. He watched it darken, then smoke, then burst into flame. The cycle continued. Outside, the snow piled higher against the door. The horse in the linta shifted its weight, huddling against the wall, dreaming of summer grass. The wind scoured the roof, searching for a way in. And the messenger sat, a guardian of the dying fire, waiting for the dawn that was miles and hours away. The visual scene held steady. The small, warm circle of firelight against the vast, encroaching darkness of the room, rendered in soft, dusty pastels, the edges of the room dissolving into deep, heavy shadow. The fire was a living thing, a small, frantic animal trapped in the stone cage of the hearth. It hissed and popped, consuming the dry splinters of the bench with a voracious hunger that seemed out of proportion to its size. The heat it threw off was negligible, a faint, trembling radius of warmth that barely reached the messenger's knees. Beyond that invisible line, The room remained a walk-in freezer, the air thick and motionless, hoarding the chill of the unlit weeks that had preceded his arrival. The cold pressed against the firelight, a physical weight, a wall of dense, blue shadow that sought to smother the intruder. The visual atmosphere was one of extreme contrast. In the center of the frame, the fire painted the hearthstones in strokes of vivid orange and deep ochre, the light catching the rough texture of the granite, highlighting the mica flecks until they sparkled like trapped stars. But at the edges of the room, the darkness was absolute, a heavy, charcoal smudge that blurred the boundaries of the walls and ceiling. The messenger sat at the intersection of these two worlds, his face illuminated in profile, a study in exhaustion rendered in warm tones against a cold background. The wool of his hood was frosted with melting ice, turning the fibers into a glistening, silver mesh. He extended his hands toward the flames. The mittens were off now, resting on the floor beside him like two severed paws. His hands were raw, the skin mottled with patches of red and waxy white. As the heat began to penetrate the frozen flesh, the pain arrived. It was not a sharp pain, but a deep, throbbing ache, a sensation of boiling water rushing through his veins. The nerves, awakening from their stupor, screamed in protest. He did not pull his hands away. He accepted the pain as a necessary price, a confirmation that he was still alive, that the extremities had not yet been claimed by the frost. He rubbed his knuckles together, the skin dry and papery, the sound like dead leaves rustling. He looked around the room again, his eyes adjusting to the low light. The cabin was a shell, a hollowed-out nut. The logs of the walls were massive, dark cylinders of timber that had absorbed the smoke of 1,000 fires. Between them, the chinking of mud and moss was cracked and falling away in places, leaving gaps where the wind whistled through, thin, high-pitched notes that harmonized with the deeper roar of the storm outside. He could see the drafts, visible as faint disturbances in the smoke that rose from the fire, swirling eddies of gray air that danced in the gloom. The table. It stood in the center of the room, a heavy, brutalist piece of furniture. It was made of slab oak, 3 inches thick, resting on legs as thick as fence posts. It was a masterpiece of durability built to outlast the station itself. It was also the only source of fuel left. To burn, it felt like a desecration, a violation of the order of things. Tables were for eating, for writing, for resting elbows upon. They were not for burning, but the logic of the storm was ruthless. The table was wood, wood was heat, heat was life. He pushed himself up from the hearth. His knees popped, a sound like dry twigs snapping. He stood for a moment, swaying slightly, waiting for the blood to reach his head. The room tilted, the shadows stretching and warping as his perspective shifted. He walked to the table, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He ran his hand across the surface. It was rough, scarred with the marks of knives and the rings of mugs, a tactile history of the messengers who had come before. He traced a deep gouge in the wood, feeling the fibers, the hardness of the grain. It would be hard work to break it. He picked up the axe again. The handle was slick with the sweat from his palms despite the cold. He tested the edge of the blade with his thumb. It was dull, pitted with rust. It would not slice, it would have to crush. He looked at the table legs. They were joined to the top with wooden pegs driven deep. He would have to smash the joints. He raised the axe. The movement stretched the muscles of his back, a dull pull of fatigue. He brought the axe down on the junction of the leg and the tabletop. Thud. The sound was dead, swallowed by the density of the wood. The axe bounced off, leaving only a shallow dent. The table did not shudder. It stood firm, mocking his weakness. He struck again, thud, and again, thud. The repetition was hypnotic, a slow, rhythmic drumming that became the heartbeat of the room. With each blow, a small chip of wood flew off, spinning into the darkness. He was not chopping wood, he was eroding it, wearing it down through sheer persistence. He stopped to breathe. The air in the room was still freezing, but the exertion had warmed him slightly. A thin sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead, instantly cooling in the draft. He leaned on the axe handle, staring at the table. One leg was beginning to loosen. A hairline crack had appeared in the joinery. He focused on that crack. It was the enemy. It was the lock he had to pick. But before he could finish, a thought pierced the fog of his exhaustion. The horse. The beast was out there under the lean-to, protected only by a roof and its own coat. The temperature was dropping. If the horse died, he was stranded. He would become a permanent resident of this dark box, another ghost story for the next rider. He had to check. He had to share the warmth. He lowered the axe and turned back to the door. The journey across the room felt longer this time. The shadows seemed to have thickened, crowding in around the small pool of firelight. He reached the door and hesitated. To open it was to let the enemy in, to break the seal he had worked so hard to establish. But he had no choice. He gripped the iron bolt. It was cold enough to burn. He slid it back, the metal screeching. He lifted the latch and pushed. The wind hit him instantly, a physical blow that staggered him back a step. A slurry of snow and ice blasted into the room, swirling across the floorboards, hissing as it hit the fire. The flames guttered, shrinking down to blue ghosts before flaring up again. He stepped out, pulling the door shut behind him as best he could, though he could not latch it from the outside. He was instantly plunged back into the blue-gray void. The cold was shocking. It was not just air. It was a solvent, stripping away the fragile layer of warmth he had accumulated inside. It bit through his wool, through his shirt, finding the sweat on his skin and turning it to ice. He pulled his scarf up, burying his face in the frozen wool. He blindly navigated the side of the cabin, one hand trailing along the rough logs to keep his bearings. The snow was deeper now, drifting against the wall, reaching his knees. He found the lean-to by the sound of the horse. The animal was shifting its weight, a rhythmic crunch of hooves on packed snow. It snorted as he approached, a sound of recognition and relief. The messenger stepped into the shelter. It was dark here, darker than the open air. The horse was a massive, warm shadow. He reached out and touched its flank. The coat was thick, matted with ice, but beneath it the body was warm. The horse was shivering, a low-frequency vibration that hummed against his hand. "Steady," he whispered into the wool of his scarf. The word was lost in the wind. He moved to the horse's head. The eyes were dark pools, reflecting nothing. Ice had formed on the eyelashes, heavy white clumps that weighed down the lids. The messenger used his bare hand. He had forgotten his mittens inside, to gently melt the ice, his thumb rubbing against the coarse hair. The horse leaned into his touch, seeking the heat. He checked the blanket he had thrown over the saddle. It was stiff, frozen into the shape of the seat. It offered little protection. He unbuckled the saddle girth, his fingers clumsy and numb. He pulled the heavy leather saddle off, the stirrups clanking softly. He set it on the ground against the wall. Then he took the blanket, unfolding it as best he could. It was like unfolding a sheet of tin. He draped it over the horse's back, over the kidneys and the flanks. It wasn't much, but it was another layer. He stood there for a moment, pressing his forehead against the horse's neck. He could smell the animal, wet fur, sweat, and the sweet, grassy scent of the oats he had poured. It was the smell of life. He closed his eyes, borrowing the warmth. For a second he considered staying there, huddled against the beast. It would be easier. The horse was a large radiator, but he knew it wasn't enough. The wind was swirling into the lean-to, piling snow around the horse's hooves. They both needed the fire. But the horse could not come inside. He patted the neck one last time, a heavy, rhythmic thud of his hand. He turned away, leaving the warmth behind. The walk back to the door was a battle. The wind was blowing directly into his face now, driving needles of ice into his eyes. He squinted, seeing only the dark outline of the door. He reached it, his hand fumbling for the latch. He pushed it open. The relief was immediate. The air inside was still cold, but it was still. It was a sanctuary. He slammed the door, throwing his weight against it to engage the latch. He slid the bolt home. He stood there, panting, his breath pluming in the dim light. He looked at the fire. It had burned down to a bed of coals, a glowing red eye in the center of the room. The shadows had reclaimed the corners. He walked to the hearth and added the last of the bench splinters. The coals accepted them, wrapping them in flame. The light grew again, pushing the shadows back a few inches. He looked at his hands. They were white, the fingers stiff and unmoving. He held them to the fire again, waiting for the pain to return. It came slowly this time, a dull throb that started in the wrists and worked its way down. He looked at the table. The crack in the leg was still there, a promise of destruction. He picked up the axe. He was tired. His arms felt like lead. His shoulders burned. But the table had to die. He swung the axe. Thud. The sound was the only thing in the world. Thud. The crack widened. Thud. A splinter flew. Thud. He fell into a trance. The repetition became a meditation. He was not thinking about the cold or the king or the messages. He was thinking about the grain of the wood. He was thinking about the angle of the blade. He was thinking about the physics of leverage. He struck the same spot over and over, chipping away at the oak. Finally, with a loud crack that sounded like a pistol shot, the leg gave way. The table listed to one side, unbalanced, looking like a wounded animal. He dropped the axe and grabbed the table edge. He heaved, his boots slipping on the floor. The heavy top crashed to the floor, the remaining legs pointing awkwardly into the air. Now came the real work. He had to break the top. It was a solid slab. He couldn't chop through it. He would have to split it. He looked for a wedge. There was nothing. He would have to use the axe head itself. He found the end grain of the slab. He positioned himself, legs apart, bracing for the impact. He raised the axe high, the metal head gleaming in the firelight. He brought it down with everything he had left. The blade bit into the end grain, sinking an inch deep. It stuck. He pulled on the handle. It didn't move. The wood had gripped the steel like a vice. He put his foot on the table and pulled. The handle groaned. The axe head remained buried. He was tethered to the table. He let go of the handle and stepped back, his chest heaving. He stared at the axe, sticking out of the wood like a monument to his futility. He felt a bubble of despair rising in his throat. It was a cold, gray bubble tasting of ash. If he couldn't split the wood, he couldn't burn it. If he couldn't burn it, the fire would go out. He sat down on the floor next to the fire. He needed to think, or maybe he just needed to rest. He looked at the flames, watching them lick at the last of the bench wood. They were beautiful, mesmerizing. They danced and twisted, shaping themselves into impossible forms. He saw cities in the fire. He saw armies. He saw the face of the king. He saw the face of the horse. He closed his eyes. The darkness was warm behind his eyelids. He could hear the wind outside scratching at the walls, trying to get in. It sounded like fingers. Thousands of ice fingers picking at the chinking, testing the door. "Let us in," the wind whispered. "We are cold. We are hungry." He snapped his eyes open. He could not sleep. Sleep was death. He looked at the axe again. He had to get it out. He crawled over to the table. He grabbed the handle. He wiggled it side to side. Creak, creak. The wood held fast. He grabbed the back of the axe head with one hand and the handle with the other. He pulled. He twisted. Suddenly the wood popped. A split appeared, running 6 inches down the slab. The axe came free. He almost fell backward. He stared at the split. It was a start, a weakness. He positioned the axe again, aiming for the same spot. He struck. The blade went into the crack, acting as a wedge. He hit the back of the axe head with a piece of the broken leg, using it as a mallet. Whack, whack, whack. The crack lengthened. It ran down the center of the table, a jagged lightning bolt in the oak. With a groan of tearing fibers, the slab split in two. The sound was loud, victorious. The messenger let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He had won. He had broken the monolith. He now had 2 halves. He could work with these. He could chop them into smaller pieces. He dragged one half closer to the fire, using it as a work surface to chop the legs into manageable billets. The wood was dry, seasoned. It would burn hot and long. He took a heavy chunk of the leg, a solid block of oak, and placed it on the fire. It sat heavily on the coals, crushing them slightly. He watched it. Smoke began to curl from the bottom, thick and gray. Then a small flame licked up the side. The bark caught. The wood began to hiss as the internal moisture boiled off. It was catching. He sat back against the wall, pulling his knees up to his chest. He wrapped his arms around his legs, hugging himself. The fire was safe for now. He had fuel. He had a pile of oak waiting to be consumed. The room was still cold, terribly cold, but the center of it was warm. The visual scene settled into a quiet, somber composition. The firelight was steady now, casting a golden glow on the floorboards and the broken remains of the table. The messenger was a dark shape against the wall, a bundle of wool and exhaustion. The axe lay on the floor, its blade shining dully. The rest of the room was a cave of blue shadows, deep and impenetrable. He listened to the silence of the room, which was not truly silence, but a collection of small, specific sounds. The tick of the cooling stone, the pop of a sap pocket in the fire, the rustle of the straw in the bunk as a mouse moved unseen. The wind outside, a constant, mournful drone. These were the sounds of his existence. He was a keeper of the fire, a breaker of tables, a man waiting for the sun in a world that seemed to have forgotten the dawn. He looked at the satchel, still slung across his shoulder. He hadn't taken it off. It was part of him. He shifted the strap, easing the pressure on his collarbone. The letters inside were silent. They did not complain about the cold. They did not ask for food. They simply waited. He wondered briefly what they said. Was it a declaration of war, a plea for help, a simple accounting of grain stores? It didn't matter. The words were ink on parchment. The only truth was the fire. He watched the flames dance, his eyelids growing heavy. The hypnotic motion of the light was a trap, a lure to drag him down into the depths of sleep. He fought it. He picked up a splinter of wood and tossed it into the fire. He watched it burn. He counted the seconds it took to turn to ash. 1, 2, 3, 4. The ash crumbled, joining the gray bed at the bottom of the grate. Dust to dust, wood to ash. The room breathed. The air expanded and contracted with the heat of the fire. The shadows pulsed. The messenger remained still, a sentinel in the dark, watching the slow, dying fire of the world burn down, one piece of furniture at a time. The cold waited outside the door, patient and eternal. The fire had now accepted the offering of the table leg. The thick block of oak, seasoned by decades of dry air and silence, burned with a slow, stubborn intensity. It did not roar or crackle with the frivolity of pine or the quick temper of straw. Instead, it settled into a deep, resonant combustion, a steady consumption of matter that released heat in dense, shimmering waves. The flames were not tall, but they were thick, sheets of orange and gold that wrapped around the wood like liquid, probing the grain, finding the knots, and turning the solid structure into a glowing sculpture of charcoal. The light in the room shifted from the frantic flickering of the kindling to a more stable, pulsating glow, a heartbeat of illumination that pushed the shadows back against the rough-hewn walls, though it could not banish them entirely. The messenger sat on the floor, his legs extended toward the hearth, the soles of his boots steaming gently. The heat was a physical force, a wall that he had built against the encroaching night. He could feel it pressing against the leather of his boots, seeking the frozen toes within. He did not remove the boots yet. To do so would be to expose the vulnerable flesh too quickly to the change in temperature, inviting the agony of the thaw before he was ready to bear it. He simply let the warmth seep through the layers, a slow, inevitable osmosis of energy transferring from the fire to the man. The visual texture of the room was dominated by this interplay of heat and cold. The air near the floor, where the drafts from the door still curled like icy snakes, was clear and sharp. Higher up, near the ceiling beams, a layer of smoke had begun to gather, a blue-gray haze that softened the details of the roof, obscuring the spider webs and the soot stains of previous years. The firelight caught the particles of dust and ash that floated in the convection currents, turning them into tiny, drifting sparks that spiraled upward and vanished into the gloom. It was a microcosm of a galaxy, a silent, swirling system of light and dark contained within 4 wooden walls. He began to unbutton his coat. The movement was slow, a deliberate articulation of stiff fingers against resistant horn buttons. The wool was thick, heavy with the moisture of the melted snow that had soaked into the fibers during the ride. As the heat of the fire hit the damp wool, it began to release its burden. Steam rose from the messenger's shoulders, ghostly white plumes that curled around his head like a spectral aura. The smell of wet sheep, of lanolin and sweat, filled the small space, an organic, earthy scent that was strangely comforting. It was the smell of life, of biology persisting in a mineral world. Button by button, the coat fell open. The cold air of the room rushed in to meet the trapped heat of his body, a brief, shocking interlude before the warmth of the fire took over. He shrugged the heavy garment off his shoulders, letting it slide down his arms. It fell to the floor behind him with a soft, heavy thud, a pile of gray shadow shedding its shape. He was left in his tunic and vest, lighter layers that felt insubstantial after the crushing weight of the greatcoat. He felt a phantom lightness, a sudden lack of pressure that made him feel as if he might float away, were it not for the gravity of his exhaustion anchoring him to the floorboards. He reached for the satchel. It was still slung across his chest, the leather strap digging a furrow into his tunic. He found the buckle, the metal warm from his body heat, and released it. The strap fell away. He lifted the bag, holding it in both hands for a moment. It was heavy, dense with the weight of parchment and wax. He set it down on the floor beside him, placing it carefully, as if it were a fragile living thing. The leather creaked as it settled, a sound like an old man sitting down in a chair. The satchel was his companion, his burden, his reason for being here. Without it, he was just a man freezing in the woods. With it, he was a conduit of the crown, a necessary link in the chain of command. He stared at the worn flap, the brass fittings tarnished and dull. He did not open it. The messages were not for him. They were sealed with the king's signet, a red wax circle pressed with the image of a lion, To break the seal was treason. To deliver it was duty. He turned his eyes back to the fire. Thirst. It arrived suddenly, a sharp, dry demand in the back of his throat. He realized he had not drunk since the last station, hours and miles ago. His mouth tasted of iron and old wool. His lips were cracked, the skin peeling in dry flakes. He needed water. But water in this place was not a liquid, it was a solid. It was the snow that lay deep and white outside the door and the ice that coated the eaves. To drink, he had to perform alchemy. He had to turn stone into water. He looked around the hearth for a vessel. There was usually a pot, an iron kettle left for this purpose. He scanned the stone shelf above the lintel. There in the shadows sat a dark, round shape. He reached up, his muscles protesting the stretch. His fingers brushed against cold, rough iron. He gripped the handle and pulled it down. It was a small cast iron pot, heavy and black with soot. He looked inside. It was empty, save for a little dust and the husk of a dead fly. He wiped it out with the hem of his tunic, a mechanical, careless gesture. He needed snow. He looked at the door. The thought of opening it again, of inviting the wind back into his sanctuary, was repulsive. He could hear the storm raging outside, a beast clawing at the wood, demanding entry. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, a high, keen sound that rose and fell like a demented violin. The door rattled in its frame, vibrating against the bolt. To open it would be a battle. He looked at the floor near the threshold. A small drift of snow had forced its way under the door, a fine white powder that lay on the floorboards like spilled flour. It was not much, but it was inside. He scooted across the floor, dragging the pot with him. He used the edge of the pot to scoop up the snow, scraping it off the wood. The snow was light, airy, compressing into a small, dense lump at the bottom of the pot. He scraped until he had gathered every grain, cleaning the floor near the door. It wasn't enough to fill the pot, but it was a start. He crawled back to the fire. He placed the pot on the edge of the coals, propping it up with a small stone so it wouldn't tip. He watched. The process was slow. The iron had to heat up, absorbing the energy from the fire before it could transfer it to the snow. For a long time, nothing happened. The snow sat there, white and pristine, defying the heat. Then slowly, the edges began to glisten. A drop of water appeared, clear and trembling, sliding down the side of the white mound to pool at the bottom. Then another. The white mass began to slump, losing its structure, turning into a gray slush. He watched the melting snow with the intensity of a diviner watching a crystal ball. It was the only movement in the room other than the flicker of the flames. The slush turned to liquid. The water was dark, reflecting the soot of the pot and the shadow of the chimney. It began to steam, a faint wisp rising from the surface. He did not wait for it to boil. He did not need it hot, he just needed it liquid. He reached out and wrapped his hand around the handle. It was warm, but not burning. He lifted the pot to his lips. The iron rim was cold against his mouth. He tilted his head back. The water rushed into his mouth, shockingly cold, tasting of metal and smoke and flat, dead ice. It was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. He swallowed greedily, the liquid cooling his throat, settling in his stomach like a heavy stone. He drank it all, every drop, leaving only the dregs of grit at the bottom. He lowered the pot, exhaling a long, satisfied breath that misted in the air. His thirst quenched, hunger followed. He reached into the pocket of his tunic. He withdrew a small cloth bundle wrapped in oilskin. He unfolded it on his lap. Inside was a block of hardtack, a dense, dry biscuit made of flour and water, baked until it was as hard as a brick, and a strip of dried beef, black and twisted like a piece of old bark. It was the ration of the road, food that would not spoil, would not freeze, and would not offer any pleasure. He picked up the beef. It was cold, stiff. He tried to bend it, and it snapped with a dry crack. He put a piece in his mouth. It was like chewing on a piece of leather belt. He worked his jaw, grinding the meat between his molars, trying to soften it with saliva. There was a faint, salty taste, a memory of brine and smoke. He chewed slowly, rhythmically, his eyes fixed on the fire. Chew, chew, swallow. The act of eating was a chore, a necessary maintenance of the machine. He did not rush. He had nowhere to go. The night was long and the food was scarce. He broke off a corner of the hardtack. He held it in his mouth, letting it soften against his tongue before he dared to bite down. To bite it dry would be to risk breaking a tooth, and a broken tooth here was a disaster he could not afford. He let the biscuit dissolve slowly, turning into a thick, floury paste. He swallowed it down. It was heavy, sitting on top of the water and the meat, a ballast in his gut. Outside, the wind shifted. The tone changed from a high whistle to a deep, resonant booming, as if the air itself was being hammered against the earth. The cabin shuddered. A sudden gust slammed against the roof, dislodging a mass of snow that slid down the shingles with a rushing, hissing sound, landing in a heavy heap in front of the windowless wall. The sound was muffled, distant, but the vibration traveled through the timbers, through the floor, into the messenger's body. He felt the fragility of his shelter. It was just wood and nails, standing against a force that could erode mountains. He thought of the horse. The image of the beast standing in the lean-to, head down, coated in ice, rose in his mind. Was the blanket enough? Was the wall enough? He listened for a sound from the animal, a stomp, a snort, but the wind drowned out everything. The silence of the horse was heavier than the noise of the storm. He felt a pang of guilt, a sharp, cold needle in his chest. He was here by the fire, drinking water and eating bread. The horse was out there in the dark. He considered going out again, checking the knot, clearing the snow from the horse's legs, but his body rebelled at the thought. His legs were heavy, filled with lead. The warmth of the fire had sapped his will. He was trapped by comfort. He told himself the horse was strong. It was bred for this. It was a creature of the north, born in the snow. It would survive. He had to believe that. If the horse died, he walked. And if he walked, he died. Therefore, the horse must live. It was a circular logic that offered no real comfort, only a barrier against panic. He looked at his hands. They were warming up. The skin was red, slightly swollen. He flexed his fingers. They moved stiffly like rusty hinges, but they moved. He rubbed his palms together, the friction creating a dry, rasping sound. He picked up a piece of the table leg, a smaller splinter that had fallen during the chopping. He tossed it into the fire. It landed on the burning log, flaring up instantly. He watched the flame consume it, turning the wood from brown to black to gray to nothing. The passage of time was marked only by the consumption of the wood. There was no clock on the wall. The sun was gone. The moon was hidden. There was only the rate of burn. He estimated he had enough wood for the night if he was careful, if he rationed the table, if he didn't let the fire get too greedy. He would have to stay awake or wake often to feed it. To let it go out was to let the cold back in, and once the cold was back, it would be twice as hard to banish. He leaned his head back against the wall. The rough logs dug into his scalp, a grounding sensation. He looked up at the ceiling. The smoke hung there, a suspended ocean of gray. He traced the shapes in the smoke. He saw mountains. He saw valleys. He saw the long, winding road that lay behind him and the long, winding road that lay ahead. The journey was a loop. Arrival, rest, departure. Arrival, rest, departure. There was no end, only the next stop. The visual scene remained static, a tableau of endurance. The fire was the anchor, the point of high contrast. The rest of the room fell away into soft, blurred darkness. The colors were muted: ochre, umber, slate, charcoal. The strokes of the drawing were heavy, capturing the weight of the air, the density of the wood, the pressure of the silence. The messenger was a small figure in the composition, dwarfed by the shadows, held in place by the gravity of the hearth. He picked up the empty pot and set it aside. The metal clinked against the stone hearth, a sharp, unnatural sound. He brushed the crumbs of hardtack from his tunic. They fell to the floor, small white specks on the dark wood. He stared at them. They looked like snow. Even here inside, the snow found a way to manifest. He closed his eyes for a second just to rest them from the glare of the fire. Immediately, the sound of the wind seemed to amplify, filling his head. It sounded like voices, not words but tones, mournful, angry, pleading, the voices of the winter. He opened his eyes quickly, pushing the sound back. He focused on the fire. The fire was real. The fire was silent. He reached for the satchel again, pulling it closer, using it as a pillow to prop up his side. The leather was cool, smooth. He rested his arm on it. It was a connection to the world of men, to the world of cities and warmth and laws. It was a tether. As long as he had the satchel, he was not lost. He was on a mission. He had a purpose. He stared into the heart of the fire where the coals were hottest, a deep, pulsing red shifting to white. It was a landscape of its own, a canyon of heat. He imagined shrinking down, walking into that canyon, bathing in the fire. The thought was seductive. The cold was so deep in his bones that he felt he would never be warm again, not truly. He was merely heating the surface while the core remained frozen. He took a deep breath. The air in the room was getting stuffier, filled with smoke and the smell of drying wool. It was a heavy atmosphere, one that induced lethargy. He fought the urge to close his eyes again. He had to watch the wood. He had to watch the table leg. It was burning down. It was time to prepare the next piece. He reached out and grabbed another billet of oak. It was heavy, solid. He held it in his hands, feeling the potential energy stored within it. Years of sunlight captured in the wood waiting to be released. He was the catalyst. He placed the wood on the fire, positioning it carefully to catch the draft. The flames licked up the sides, welcoming the new fuel. The cycle continued. The fire burned. The wind blew. The messenger waited. The fire was a clock that burned its own hands. It was the only measure of time remaining in the universe of the cabin, a slow, consuming dial that marked the passage of the night in increments of carbon and ash. The messenger watched the oak billet he had placed on the grate. It had passed the stage of initial ignition, where the flames licked eagerly at the bark, and had settled into the deep, serious work of combustion. The wood was glowing from the inside out, a block of incandescent matter that pulsed with a steady, rhythmic heat. Cracks had formed along the grain, glowing veins of magma that widened and breathed with the draft, revealing the intense, hidden energy stored within the dense fibers of the tree. The light in the room had stabilized into a dim, amber stasis. It was not a bright light. It did not reach the corners where the shadows stood like tall, silent men in gray cloaks. It was a local light, a sphere of influence that barely extended past the hearthstone. Within this sphere, the colors were rich and saturated. The deep russet of the messenger's drying tunic, the polished black of his boots, the gray of the stone floor which now held a faint, reflected warmth. Outside the sphere, the world was a study in cold blues and charcoal sketch lines, a grainy, indistinct void that seemed to press inward, testing the strength of the illumination. The messenger shifted his weight on the floor. The hard planks had become a part of his anatomy, a pressure that he no longer felt as discomfort but as a grounding fact of existence. He was sitting with his back against the wall, his legs stretched out toward the fire, his hands resting loosely in his lap. The movement was microscopic, a slight adjustment of the spine, a shifting of the hip bone, but in the stillness of the room it felt momentous. The leather of his belt creaked, a dry, weary sound that was instantly absorbed by the heavy air. He looked at his hands. They were no longer the waxy, frozen claws they had been an hour ago. The blood had returned, bringing with it a deep, flushed color that looked like a bruise under the skin. The veins on the back of his hands stood out, dark blue rivers navigating the landscape of his knuckles. He flexed his fingers, watching the tendons move, the mechanics of the hand operating with a slow, hydraulic grace. There was a lingering stiffness, a resistance in the joints that spoke of the cold's reluctance to let go, but the paralysis was gone. He was reclaiming his body inch by inch from the domain of the ice. The air in the room had changed texture. It was no longer the sharp, crystalline vacuum of the outside. It was heavier, thicker, laden with the byproducts of survival. There was the smell of wood smoke, sweet and resinous, dominating the olfactory landscape. Underneath that was the scent of the messenger himself, the damp wool, the leather, the faint, metallic tang of sweat that had dried and then moistened again. And beneath that, the smell of the cabin itself, the dust of the floorboards, the old, dry rot of the logs, the mineral scent of the stone hearth. It was a complex, layered atmosphere, a fog of scents that filled the nose and coated the throat. He took a breath, tasting the air. It was dry, despite the melting snow on his coat. The fire was sucking the moisture out of the room, turning the atmosphere arid. He felt the dryness in his eyes, which felt gritty and heavy, the lids sliding over the eyeballs with a friction that made him want to keep them closed. He blinked slowly, a shutter descending on a camera lens. The darkness behind his eyelids was not black, but a swirling field of afterimages, the ghost of the fire, the shape of the table, the endless white line of the road. He forced his eyes open. Sleep was the enemy. Sleep was the siren song of the hypothermia he had just escaped. If he slept, the fire would die. If the fire died, the room would return to the ambient temperature of the storm. He had to remain vigilant. He was the keeper of the flame, a role that required a monotonous, unwavering attention. He looked at the pile of wood he had created. The remains of the table lay in a chaotic heap on the floor, a sculpture of destruction. There were the legs chopped into thick blocks. There were the jagged shards of the tabletop split and splintered. It looked like a lot of wood. It looked like a fortress of fuel. But he knew the deception of the fire. It was a hungry mouth that never stopped eating. What looked like a night's worth of wood could be gone in hours if he was careless. He had to ration the heat. He had to balance the need for warmth against the finite nature of the table. He reached out and picked up a small splinter of oak, a long, thin dagger of wood that had flown off during the splitting. He held it up to the firelight, examining the grain. It was tight, straight, the sign of a tree that had grown slowly in a cold climate. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the rough texture, the sharp edges. He tossed it into the fire. It landed on the glowing log and burst into flame instantly. A brief, bright flare that illuminated the soot-stained stones of the chimney breast before consuming itself and vanishing into ash. The sound of the wind outside had shifted again. It was no longer a constant roar, but a series of rhythmic gusts, a breathing of the storm. Whoosh, silence, whoosh, silence. The pattern was hypnotic, a lullaby of violence played against the walls of the cabin. Each gust shook the door in its frame, a rattle of iron and wood that sounded like someone trying to get in. The messenger did not look at the door. He knew what was on the other side. He knew the white wall of snow that was slowly burying the station, climbing the logs, sealing him in. He thought of the messages in the satchel, The leather bag sat next to him, a dark, slumped shape on the floor. The contents were a mystery that he was forbidden to solve, yet in the boredom of the watch his mind began to invent them. Perhaps they were orders to retreat. Perhaps they were news of a birth. Perhaps they were simply blank pages, a test of his loyalty. It didn't matter. The physical reality of the parchment was all that existed. They were dry. They were safe. They were waiting. His gaze drifted to the ceiling. The beams were lost in the gloom, visible only as darker stripes against the dark roof. The smoke from the fire pooled up there, a spectral ocean that undulated with the drafts. He watched a single wisp of smoke detach itself from the main cloud and drift down, curling like a vine, before being caught by the thermal updraft and pulled back into the chimney. It was a silent ballet, a dance of gray on black. The visual style of the moment was heavy on texture. The rough wool of his trousers, illuminated by the firelight, looked like a landscape of miniature hills and valleys, the fibers catching the orange glow. The stone of the hearth was pitted and scarred, a map of geological time. The floorboards were etched with the grain of the wood, the shadows pooling in the microscopic valleys of the timber. Everything was tactile, visceral. The world had shrunk to the things he could touch, the things he could see within the radius of the fire. He felt a deep, resonant vibration in the floor. It was the horse shifting its weight in the lean-to outside. The heavy hoof striking the frozen ground sent a tremor through the earth that traveled through the foundation of the cabin and into the messenger's body. It was a communication. "I am here," the vibration said. "I am cold, but I am here." The messenger closed his eyes and nodded, a slight dip of his chin. "I know," he thought. "I am here too." He checked the fire again. The log was breaking down. The center had collapsed into a bed of glowing coals, a landscape of intense, pulsating heat. The sides were charred and black, flaking away in white ash. It was time to add more. He did not want the temperature to drop. He reached for one of the table legs. It was a heavy block, the foot of the table still visible, worn smooth by years of contact with the floor. He weighed it in his hand. It was solid oak, dense as stone. He placed it carefully on the coals. He did not throw it. He placed it with reverence, positioning it so that the air could flow around it, feeding the fire. The coals hissed as the cold wood touched them. Smoke began to curl around the block, seeking a purchase. The messenger watched, holding his breath, waiting for the catch. It took a moment. The wood had to warm up. It had to accept the fire. Then a small blue flame appeared at the base, dancing along the edge of the block. It grew, turning yellow, then orange. The wood was burning. He sat back, satisfied. The ritual was complete for another hour. He adjusted his position against the wall, trying to find a softer spot on the hard logs. There was none. The wall was unyielding. He pulled his knees up, wrapping his arms around them, creating a closed loop of body heat. He rested his chin on his knees, staring into the flames. The concept of the last stop began to turn in his mind. It was a name on a map, a designation of distance. But tonight it felt literal. This was the end of the line. Beyond the cabin walls, the world had ceased to exist. There was no road. There was no capital city. There was only the white void. He was the last man tending the last fire in the last structure on Earth. The thought was not frightening, it was peaceful. It simplified things. There was no need to worry about the future if there was no future. There was only the duty of the fire. He listened to the silence between the gusts of wind. It was a heavy, pressurized silence. The kind of silence that you can hear ringing in your ears. It was the sound of the blood rushing through his head, the sound of his own existence. Thump, 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 thump. His heart was slow, steady, a drum beating a retreat. He focused on the rhythm. It was slower than the horse's gait, slower than the wind. It was the rhythm of hibernation. The shadows in the corner seemed to lengthen, stretching out toward him. He watched them without alarm. They were just the absence of light. They were the natural state of the room. The fire was the intruder. The fire was the anomaly. The darkness was the truth. He felt a strange kinship with the shadows. They were patient. They would wait until the wood was gone, and then they would reclaim the room. They would cover the messenger and the satchel and the ashes in a soft, gray blanket of obscurity. He picked up a handful of ash from the edge of the hearth. It was cool, gray, soft as flour. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger. It was the ghost of the wood. It was what remained when the energy was spent. He let it fall back into the grate, a fine dust that vanished into the updraft. Everything ends in ash. The message, the messenger, the table, the fire. It was all just a transition of states. He felt a draft across his ankles. The cold air was finding a way in, sneaking under the door, slithering across the floorboards. He watched the dust motes in the air. They were swirling in a new pattern, agitated by the intrusion. The cold was a persistent besieger. It tested the defenses, looking for a weakness. He tucked his feet closer to his body, shrinking his footprint. He pulled the edges of his tunic tighter. The visual scene darkened slightly as the new log absorbed the heat before releasing it. The room grew dimmer, the corners retreating further into the black. The messenger's face was a mask of shadows, the firelight catching only the ridge of his nose, the curve of his brow, the line of his jaw. He looked like a drawing in an old book, a figure sketched in sepia ink on parchment. He was still motionless, a part of the still life. He remembered the taste of the water, the cold, metallic shock of it. He ran his tongue over his lips. They were dry again. The fire was a thief stealing moisture from everything it touched. He looked at the pot. It was empty. He considered getting more snow, but the thought of the door, of the wind, of the effort was too much. He would wait. He would endure the thirst. It was a small discomfort compared to the freezing. He watched the flames lick the side of the table leg. The varnish on the wood, if there ever was any, was long gone, but the wood itself had a richness to it, a memory of the forest. He imagined the tree that had become the table. A great oak standing in a green forest, the sun warm on its leaves, birds nesting in its branches, squirrels running on its bark. That summer day was trapped in the wood, released now, centuries later in this dark, frozen cabin. He was warming himself with the ghost of a summer from long ago. The irony was not lost on him. To survive the winter, he had to consume the summer. To live, he had to destroy the furniture of his trade. He watched a knot in the wood glow brighter than the surrounding area, a fierce, angry red. It popped with a sharp sound, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The sparks swirled like fireflies, rising into the dark throat of the flue, carrying their tiny heat up into the night. He let his head rest back against the logs. The wood was hard, pressing into his skull. He stared at the ceiling beams again. He counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 heavy beams holding up the roof, holding up the snow, holding up the sky. They were black with age and soot. They looked like the ribs of a great beast, and he was inside the belly, kept warm by the digestion of the fire. The wind moaned, a long, low note that vibrated the door. The latch clicked, a metal-on-metal sound that echoed in the quiet. The messenger's eyes flicked to the door, but he did not move. He trusted the bolt. He trusted the ice that sealed the frame. He was safe, for now. He returned his gaze to the fire. The orange light filled his vision, burning an afterimage into his retinas. Even when he blinked, he saw the flames. They were etched into his mind. The fire was the only reality. The rest was just waiting. The visual composition remained static. The glow, the shadow, the man, the wood. a suspended moment in a long, cold night. The fire had settled into a deep, meditative hum, a sound that was less a noise and more a vibration of the air itself. The heavy block of the table leg, once a rigid structural element of the furniture, had now surrendered its form entirely to the heat. It was no longer wood. It was a glowing ingot of charcoal, retaining the rectangular shape of the lumber but pulsing with a translucent, inner light that seemed to breathe with the subtle fluctuations of the chimney draft. The surface of the log was a landscape of fissures and canyons, a geological map of combustion where the terrain shifted and crumbled in slow motion. The messenger watched a single flake of white ash detach itself from the top of the burning block. It rose on a thermal current, a tiny, weightless ghost, drifting upward into the dark throat of the chimney. He tracked its flight with a dull, heavy gaze, his eyes moving slowly in their sockets. The ash danced, caught in the invisible turbulence of the hot air, swirling in a lazy spiral before vanishing into the soot-stained void above. It was a small, silent departure, a microscopic event in the quiet history of the room, yet it held his attention completely. The visual atmosphere of the cabin had thickened. The air was no longer transparent. It was textured, filled with the microscopic detritus of the fire and the dust disturbed by the earlier movements. In the dim light, this particulate matter caught the glow of the embers, creating a soft, hazy volume of air that looked like a suspension of gold dust in dark oil. The corners of the room were not just dark. They were solid blocks of shadow, drawn in heavy, cross-hatched lines of charcoal and indigo, pressing inward against the fragile sphere of warmth. The messenger felt the cold pressing against his back. The wall behind him was a conductor of the freezing temperatures outside. The massive logs, though thick, could not hold back the sheer, crushing weight of the winter indefinitely. He could feel the chill radiating from the wood, seeping through his tunic, through his vest, seeking the heat of his skin. It was a stark contrast to the front of his body, which was bathed in the radiant energy of the fire. He was a creature divided, existing simultaneously in two climates, a tropical zone of firelight and an Arctic zone of shadow. He shifted his shoulders, rubbing his back against the rough logs to generate a fleeting friction of warmth. The movement was slow, a sluggish ripple of muscle under the wool. He pulled his legs in tighter, crossing his ankles. The leather of his boots was warm to the touch now. The stiffness melted away, replaced by a pliable softness. He could feel his toes inside, warm and alive, no longer the numb blocks of wood they had been upon arrival. This small victory, the reclamation of his feet, felt significant, a triumph of biology over the elements. He looked at the remaining pile of wood. The wreckage of the table lay on the floorboards, a chaotic still life of splintered oak. There were 3 legs left, and the 2 halves of the tabletop split down the middle but still massive slabs. It was a finite resource. He performed a slow mental calculation, a math of survival. If each leg burned for 2 hours and the slabs for 3, he had enough. But only if he was careful, only if he did not get greedy with the flames. He reached out and picked up a shard of wood, a long, jagged piece that had been part of the table's apron. It was thin, shaped like a spearhead. He held it up, examining the silhouette against the fire. The light shone through the thin edges of the wood, turning them a deep, translucent amber. He traced the grain with his thumb, feeling the rough texture of the split fibers. It was dry, brittle. He snapped it in half. The sound was a sharp crack, a pistol shot in the library of silence. He tossed the pieces into the fire. They landed on the bed of coals and ignited instantly, sending up a flare of yellow light that momentarily pushed the shadows back a few inches. The light flickered across the messenger's face, illuminating the fatigue that was etched into his features. His eyes were heavy, the lids drooping under the weight of exhaustion. The desire to sleep was a physical pressure, a heavy blanket draped over his mind. But the fear of the cold was a sharper goad. He knew the danger of the drift. If he closed his eyes, the fire would burn down. The room would cool. The cold would creep in, soothing and anesthetic, and he would simply never wake up. He had to stay conscious. He had to be the watchman. To keep himself awake, he focused on the sensory details of his immediate environment. He listened to the wind. It had changed its voice again. Earlier, it had been a howl, a high-pitched scream of velocity. Now it was a low, resonant thrumming, a bass note that vibrated in the foundation of the cabin. It sounded like the earth itself was groaning under the weight of the snow. The snow was piling up outside, banking against the walls, burying the cabin. The muffled quality of the wind suggested that the drifts were getting higher, insulating the structure, turning it into an igloo of timber and stone. He looked at the satchel again. The leather was dark, rich with the patina of age. The brass buckle gleamed dully in the firelight, a single, unblinking eye. He reached out and touched the flap. The leather was cool, smoother than the rough wood of the floor. He ran his finger along the stitching, feeling the wax thread, the craftsmanship of the royal saddlers. Inside that bag were the words of a king, commands that moved armies, decrees that changed laws, but here in this frozen valley they were just paper. Their authority did not extend to the weather. The wind did not obey the king. The snow did not recognize the seal. The messenger felt a strange sense of detachment from his duty. He was no longer a servant of the crown. He was a servant of the fire. He picked up the axe. The handle was warm now, having absorbed the ambient heat of the hearth. The steel head was still cool, a heavy weight at the end of the shaft. He needed to process more wood. The slabs of the tabletop were too big to fit in the fireplace as they were. They needed to be split again. He dragged one of the halves of the tabletop closer to the hearth, moving it with a slow, scraping sound across the floorboards. The wood was heavy, dense. He positioned it so that one end rested on a piece of the broken leg, creating a bridge. He knelt beside it, the floor hard against his knees. He raised the axe, not high, just enough to generate momentum. He brought it down. Thunk. The blade bit into the wood, sticking fast. He didn't try to pull it out. He lifted the wood and the axe together, raising them both a few inches, and slammed them down on the floor. Crack. The wood split further. He repeated the motion. Lift, slam, lift, slam. The rhythm was hypnotic. It was a dull, repetitive labor that required no thought, only mechanics. The sound of the wood splitting was the only punctuation in the long sentence of the night. Crack, creak, snap. Finally, the slab fell apart into two smaller pieces. He set the axe down, his breathing slightly elevated, a small cloud of mist forming in front of his face with each exhalation. The exertion had warmed him, sending a fresh wave of blood to his extremities. He took one of the new pieces, a thick, triangular wedge of oak, and placed it next to the fire to dry. It was already dry, but the ritual of warming the wood before burning it felt necessary, a way of preparing the sacrifice. He arranged the other pieces in a neat stack, building a small wall of fuel between himself and the door, a rampart against the inevitable end of the supply. He sat back against the wall, assuming his previous position. The visual composition of the scene returned to stasis. The fire, the man, the shadows. The palette was limited to the warm oranges of the flame and the cool, dusty blues of the room's periphery. The texture of the scene was soft, grainy, like a pastel drawing where the colors have been rubbed and blended with a thumb. There were no sharp edges, only gradients of light and dark. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the afterimage of the fire float in the darkness. He listened to the silence within the room. It was not empty. It was filled with the small, microscopic sounds of the cabin settling, a beam creaking overhead as the temperature changed, the hiss of a pocket of moisture in the firewood, the scratch of a mouse in the wall waking up to the warmth. These sounds were the heartbeat of the shelter. He thought of the horse again. The image of the beast was a constant companion in his mind. He imagined the horse standing in the lean-to, head lowered, endurance personified. He hoped the animal was sleeping, standing up as horses do, locked in a state of suspended animation. He hoped the blanket was still in place. The bond between messenger and horse was a silent, profound thing, forged in miles and silence. He felt the absence of the animal's warmth, a phantom limb sensation on his side where the horse's flank would be. He opened his eyes and looked at the fire. The large log had broken down further. It was now a heap of glowing cubes, a city of embers. The heat was intense, radiating out in waves that distorted the air above the grate. He could see the shimmer, the mirage of the heat. It was the only thing moving in the room. He felt a thirst again, but it was a distant, dull sensation. He ignored it. He did not want to move to get more snow. The lethargy of the warmth was a heavy chain binding him to the floor. He was content to sit, to stare, to exist. The world outside had ceased to matter. The war, the peace, the taxes, the laws, they were all abstractions. The only reality was the oxidation of carbon. He watched the smoke rise. It curled up the chimney, a gray ribbon unraveling into the dark. He wondered where it went. Did it rise into the sky, joining the clouds? Did it dissipate into the forest, carrying the scent of oak to the sleeping trees? It was a message of its own, a signal that life still existed in this valley. A thin, gray flag planted in the conquest of winter. The shadows on the wall seemed to move, shifting as the fire flared and dimmed. They looked like figures dancing, slow and mournful. He watched them with a detached curiosity. They were the ghosts of the previous travelers, the men who had sat in this same spot, burned this same wood, waited for this same dawn. He was just the latest in a long line of watchers. He felt a kinship with them, a brotherhood of the frozen road. He reached for a small chip of wood, a splinter no bigger than a finger. He held it to the fire, letting the flame catch the end. It burned like a match, a tiny torch. He held it up, watching the flame consume the wood, moving down toward his fingers. He held it until the heat became uncomfortable, then tossed it into the grate. It was a game, a way to pass the seconds. Time was stretching. The night felt endless, a tunnel with no light at the end. The messenger did not look for the dawn. To hope for the sun was to invite disappointment. He accepted the night as a permanent state. He settled into the waiting, letting his mind drift on the slow, dark currents of his fatigue. He was a stone in a river, the water of time flowing around him, smooth and cold. He adjusted his scarf, pulling the loose wool tighter around his neck. The material was warm now, dry and scratchy against his skin. It was a comfort. He tucked his chin down, burying the lower half of his face in the fabric. He breathed in the scent of the wool, the smell of the fire. It was a closed loop of sensation. The fire popped, a loud, sharp sound that echoed in the room. A spark landed on the hearthstone, glowing bright red for a second before fading to black. The messenger watched it die. He did not move. He was a statue carved from patience and exhaustion. The visual scene held, The dark room, the pool of light, the solitary figure, the waiting silence. The fire had entered a new phase of its life cycle, a period of intense, brooding heat that radiated from the heart of the hearth. The large block of the table leg, which had been a distinct, geometric shape of wood only an hour ago, had now collapsed into a nebulous mound of glowing charcoal. It was a landscape of pure energy, a miniature mountain range of oscillating reds and whites that breathed with the influx of the draft. The structure of the wood was gone, replaced by the structure of the heat itself. The flames were low, clinging close to the coals, licking over the surface like fluid, transparent ghosts of blue and violet. It was a quieter fire now, less aggressive than the initial conflagration of the straw and kindling, but far more powerful in its persistence. The messenger watched this transformation with a heavy, lidded gaze. His eyes were dry, the moisture sucked out of them by the arid heat of the room, forcing him to blink with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Each blink was a moment of darkness that lasted a fraction of a second too long, a micro-sleep that threatened to pull him under. He fought the gravity of his eyelids, forcing them open to stare once more at the mesmerizing patterns of the combustion. He was a sentinel of the oxidation process, a witness to the conversion of matter into survival. The visual atmosphere of the cabin had deepened into a profound, suffocating gloom. The light from the coals was steady but dim, a deep, resonant amber that barely reached the middle of the room. The corners were no longer just shadows. They were voids, absences of reality where the walls and the floor dissolved into a soft, grainy blackness. The visual style was heavy and textured, like a drawing done on coarse, dark paper where the artist has pressed hard with the black pastel, obliterating the grain, leaving only the suggestion of shapes in the negative space. The messenger was a figure rendered in sepia and rust, a warm island in a cold sea. He shifted his position on the floor, the movement creating a dull ache in his hips. The floorboards were unforgiving, hard planks of frozen timber that offered no comfort to the human frame. He pulled his legs in closer, crossing them at the ankles, tucking his boots beneath the hem of his tunic to capture the last vestiges of warmth. The leather of his boots was dry now, the snow melt evaporated, leaving the material stiff and creased. He could feel the texture of the socks inside, the wool matting against his skin, a sensation of friction that was both irritating and reassuring. It was a tactile reminder that he still had feet, that the numbness had not returned. The silence of the room was heavy, a physical pressure that pushed against his eardrums. It was not a true silence, but a collection of muted noises that emphasized the isolation. There was the soft, rhythmic hiss of the coals, the occasional pop of a cooling stone, and the low, constant vibration of the wind outside. The wind had settled into a monotone drone, a single, sustained note that resonated in the chimney flute. It was the sound of the atmosphere moving over the earth, a vast, indifferent force that scoured the landscape, burying the world in white. He reached out his hand toward the wood pile. The movement was slow, a drifting of the limb through the heavy air. His fingers brushed against the rough surface of the split tabletop. The wood was cool to the touch, having absorbed the chill of the floor. He traced the grain, feeling the ridges and valleys of the oak. It was a map of the tree's life, a record of wet springs and dry summers, of storms and stillness. He selected a piece, a thick, triangular wedge that had been part of the table's edge. It was heavy, dense with history. He lifted the wood, feeling the strain in his forearm. His muscles were tired, depleted of glycogen, running on the fumes of his own endurance. He placed the wedge on the bed of coals. He did not throw it. He deposited it with the care of a jeweler placing a gem in a setting. He positioned it so that the flat side rested on the hottest part of the embers, ensuring a clean, efficient burn. The coals hissed in protest as the cold wood touched them, a sound like water hitting a hot pan. Smoke began to curl around the wedge, gray and thick, seeking the updraft. He watched the smoke. It was a fluid, serpentine shape that twisted and turned in the firelight, rising up the chimney to join the storm. He imagined the smoke exiting the chimney pot, emerging into the freezing night, being instantly torn apart by the wind. It was a signal that no one would see, a beacon for a world that was asleep. The messenger leaned back against the logs of the wall. The cold from the timber seeped through his vest, a dull, insidious chill that sought to merge with his spine. He adjusted his scarf, pulling the wool up over his nose again. The air in the room was stratified, warm near the fire, freezing near the walls. He existed in the boundary layer, the turbulent zone between the two extremes. He breathed into the scarf, warming the air before it entered his lungs. The wool smelled of wood smoke and old lanolin, a scent that was becoming the only reality he knew. He thought of the satchel. It lay next to him, a dark, slumped shape on the floorboards. He reached out and touched the leather flap. It was cold, smooth, polished by years of handling. He ran his finger over the brass buckle, feeling the hard, metallic edge. Inside were the letters. He pictured them in his mind, folded parchment, sealed with red wax, the impress of the lion. They were silent passengers on this journey, carrying words that might mean life or death for someone somewhere. But here they were just weight, they were ballast. He wondered if the ink had frozen. He wondered if the words had shattered in the cold. It was a foolish thought born of fatigue, but it lingered. He imagined opening a letter and shaking it, watching the words fall out like broken glass, a pile of vowels and consonants on the floor. He withdrew his hand. The letters were not for him. His job was the road. His job was the fire. The wind gusted outside, a sudden increase in pressure that shook the door in its frame. The latch rattled, a sharp metallic clack-clack that sounded like a skeletal finger tapping on the wood. The messenger's eyes flicked to the door, checking the bolt. It was still thrown, the iron bar solid in its bracket. The ice that sealed the frame had held. The white line of mortar was intact. He relaxed, letting his gaze return to the fire. The new piece of wood had caught. The smoke had ignited, transforming into a sheet of yellow flame that wrapped around the wedge. The light in the room brightened imperceptibly, pushing the shadows back a fraction of an inch. The orange glow danced on the floorboards, illuminating the dust and the debris of the chopped table. The messenger watched the flames consume the oak. It was a slow, violent process, the heat tearing the wood apart, releasing the energy stored within. He felt a thirst again. The water he had drunk earlier had been absorbed, used by his body to keep the blood flowing, to keep the organs functioning. His throat was dry, his tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth. He looked at the iron pot. It was empty, sitting cold on the hearthstone. He considered the effort required to get more snow. He would have to move. He would have to go to the door. He would have to scrape the floor. It seemed like a monumental task, a journey of miles. He decided to wait. He would endure the thirst a little longer. He closed his eyes, focusing on the sensation of the heat on his face. It was a mask of warmth, a glowing pressure that kept the frostbite at bay. He felt the skin of his cheeks, tight and dry. He rubbed his face with his hands, the rough skin of his palms rasping against the stubble on his jaw. The sound was loud in the quiet room. He listened for the horse. The vibration he had felt earlier was gone. The animal was still. He hoped it was sleeping. He hoped the blanket had stayed in place. He imagined the horse's breath steaming in the lean-to, creating a small cloud of warmth around its muzzle. He felt a pang of guilt, sharp and cold. He was inside by the fire. The horse was outside in the wind. It was the hierarchy of the road, but it felt like a betrayal. He forced his mind away from the horse. He could do nothing for it now. To go out would be to waste heat, to risk the fire. He had to trust the beast. He had to trust the breeding. He focused on the fire again. The wedge of oak was burning well. The bark was gone, replaced by a layer of char that glowed red. The heart of the wood was beginning to crack, opening up to the heat. He picked up a small splinter from the floor, a tiny shard of wood that had been missed in the cleanup. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, twirling it in the light. It was a fragile thing, easily broken. He snapped it in two. Snap. He threw the pieces into the flames. They vanished instantly, consumed by the greater fire. It was a small offering, a token gesture. The passage of time was marked by the degradation of the wood. The sharp edges of the wedge were rounding off, turning into soft curves of ash. The yellow flames were settling down, becoming blue and transparent again. The cycle was repeating. The fire was a hungry god demanding constant sacrifice. The messenger was the priest, tending the altar. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He stared into the depths of the fire, past the flames, into the bed of coals. It was a world of infinite detail. He saw caverns of glowing red. He saw pillars of white ash. He saw valleys of deep, dark orange. It was a landscape that changed every second, a shifting topography of heat. He lost himself in it, his mind drifting away from the cold room, away from the snow, into the burning canyon. The heat was hypnotic. It lulled him, pulling at his consciousness. He felt his head nod, dropping toward his chest. He jerked it back up, startled by the sudden movement. He shook his head, clearing the fog. He could not sleep. Not yet. The wood needed watching. The fire needed air. He looked around the room, forcing his eyes to focus on the shadows. He saw the outline of the bunk in the corner. The straw mattress looked inviting, a soft nest in the dark. But it was too far from the fire. It was in the cold zone. To lie there would be to freeze. The floor was hard, but it was warm. This was his bed for the night. The hearthstone was his pillow. He checked the stack of wood. It was diminishing. The table was slowly disappearing. He calculated the volume of the remaining pieces against the length of the night. It would be close. He might have to burn the bench legs as well. He might have to burn the bunk frame. He would burn the whole station if he had to. The mission was to survive. The station could be rebuilt. The messenger could not. He felt a draft on his neck, a cold finger of air that had found a way through the chinking. He turned his head, looking at the wall behind him. There was a small gap between the logs where the moss had dried and fallen away. A tiny stream of freezing air was pouring in, invisible but palpable. He reached out and grabbed a handful of the debris from the floor, wood chips, dust, dirt. He pressed it into the gap, packing it tight with his thumb. The draft stopped. It was a small victory, a repair of the hull. He wiped his hand on his trousers, leaving a streak of soot and dust on the wool. He was becoming part of the room, covered in its grime, smelling of its smoke. He was no longer the royal messenger. He was the man in the cabin, a primal figure, stripped of rank and title, reduced to the basic elements of survival. The wind outside shifted again, dropping in pitch. It sounded like a heavy object being dragged across the roof. The snow was shifting, sliding on the shingles. The weight of the winter was pressing down on the structure. The beams overhead groaned, a low, complaining sound of wood under stress. The messenger looked up, his eyes tracing the dark lines of the rafters. They held. They were old, seasoned timber cut from the forest when the world was younger. They would hold. He looked back at the fire. The wedge of oak was now fully engulfed, a glowing part of the whole. The heat was steady. The room was stable. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the dry, smoky air. He held it for a moment, then exhaled slowly. Crunch, step, breath. The rhythm of the ride echoed in his memory, a phantom cadence that played in the silence. He could feel the sway of the saddle, the jolt of the hooves. The road was still with him, imprinted on his nervous system. He was still riding, even while sitting still. The journey did not end when the movement stopped. It continued in the mind, a perpetual motion of the soul. He rested his head on his knees again. He watched the flames through the tunnel of his arms. The world was small. The world was warm. The world was burning. He waited for the next shift in the log, the next pop of a spark, the next signal from the fire. The visual scene remained a study in stillness. The dark room, the glowing hearth, the slumped figure, the heavy, suffocating silence of the deep night. The fire had reached a stage of ancient, heavy stability. The triangular wedge of oak tabletop had lost its sharp edges, becoming a rounded, glowing heart of heat that pulsed at the center of the grate. It was no longer consuming oxygen with the frantic appetite of a new flame. Instead, it breathed with the slow, rhythmic cadence of an organism in hibernation. The surface of the wood was covered in a thick, white lace of ash that glowed from within, a delicate skeleton of the tree that remained even as the substance was eaten away. Every few minutes, a small piece of this crust would fall away, revealing the incandescent orange flesh beneath. A light so pure and intense it seemed to vibrate against the soot-blackened stones of the hearth. The visual atmosphere of the cabin had become a study in deep, saturated indigo and burnt umber. The light from the embers did not travel far. It clung to the floorboards and the messenger's knees, leaving the rest of the room to the domain of a grainy, velvet darkness. The smoke that had gathered near the ceiling beams was now a thick, motionless layer, a gray sea that swallowed the rafters and the roof. In the dim light, the texture of the room was exaggerated. The cracks in the floorboards were deep canyons of shadow, and the grain of the log walls looked like the ridges of a distant mountain range. It was a world rendered in charcoal and soft pastel on a midnight surface, where every detail was softened by the haze of smoke and exhaustion. The messenger felt the weight of the air on his shoulders. It was a heavy, pressurized atmosphere, a combination of the low ceiling, the smoke, and the crushing silence of the storm outside. He sat perfectly still, his chin resting on his chest, his hands folded in the hollow of his lap. He was no longer fighting the fatigue. He was drifting within it, suspended in a state of wakeful dreaming. His thoughts were not linear. They were images, fleeting and dim, like the shadows on the wall. He saw the flicker of a lantern in a distant window. He heard the sound of a bell ringing in a valley he had passed days ago. He felt the phantom brush of a branch against his shoulder. He blinked and the images vanished, replaced by the reality of the dying log. He needed to move. His body felt like it was made of cold lead, the joints rusted shut by the hours of immobility. He took a slow, deep breath, the dry air raspy in his throat. He reached out his right arm toward the stack of wood. The movement felt alien, a mechanical articulation of a limb that no longer belonged to him. His fingers brushed against the rough edge of a table leg. The wood was cold, a shocking contrast to the heat on his face. He gripped it, his mittens long since cast aside, feeling the hardness of the grain against his calloused skin. He pulled the leg toward him, the wood scraping across the floorboards with a sound that felt unnecessarily loud. He lifted it and placed it on the fire. This piece was different. It was the top of the leg, where the joinery was thickest, a solid block of seasoned oak. It landed on the bed of coals with a dull thud, sending a flurry of sparks up the chimney. They swirled in the dark flue, tiny, frantic points of light that burned out before they reached the cold night air. The messenger watched them, his eyes following the trail of their extinction. He sat back, the effort of moving the wood leaving him slightly breathless. He felt the cold air from the floor creeping into the gap between his boots and his trousers. He adjusted his position, pulling his feet closer to the heat. The leather of his boots was dry and hard, the heat having sucked the moisture from the hide until it was as stiff as iron. He could feel the pulse in his ankles, a slow, heavy thrumming that matched the rhythm of the fire. The sound of the wind had evolved. It was no longer a roar or a whistle. It had become a physical vibration, a low-frequency hum that vibrated the very stones of the hearth. The snow was now so deep against the walls that the cabin had become a part of the landscape, a hummock of wood in a desert of white. The sound was muffled as if the world were being viewed through a thick layer of wool. This insulation brought a strange, terrifying peace. He was buried alive, yet he was warm. He was in a tomb of his own making, a sanctuary built from the wreckage of a table. He looked at the satchel. It was a dark shape against the floor, its leather surface catching a faint, oily reflection from the fire. He reached out and touched the strap, his fingers tracing the heavy stitching. He wondered about the person who had written the letters inside. Were they sitting by a fire as well? Were they warm? Did they know that their words were currently being guarded by a man who was burning a table to stay alive? The disconnect between the world of the letters and the world of the messenger felt vast, an unbridgeable chasm of ice and shadow. The letters were from a world of intentions. The messenger was in a world of consequences. He felt a thirst, more insistent now. His mouth was like a desert, his tongue dry and heavy. He looked at the iron pot. He knew he should go to the door, scrape the snow from the threshold, and melt more water. He knew the machine of his body required it. But the inertia of the cold was a heavy hand on his shoulder, pinning him to the spot. He stared at the pot, imagining the cold, metallic taste of the melted snow. He stayed where he was. The effort of survival was becoming more and more focused on the single act of maintaining the fire. Everything else was secondary. Everything else could wait. He watched the new block of oak catch. It was a slow process. The wood was so dense that the fire had to work for its entry. A thin line of blue flame appeared along the edge of the joinery, dancing back and forth like a living thing. Then it turned yellow, then orange, as the fire found a crack and drove deep into the heart of the wood. A thick, sweet-smelling smoke began to rise, the scent of oak and old varnish filling the room. It was a rich, heavy smell, one that suggested longevity and endurance. He leaned his head back against the log wall. The wood was hard, pressing against the base of his skull. He stared at the ceiling beams, which were now entirely hidden by the smoke. He felt as if he were at the bottom of a well, looking up into a dark, impenetrable sky. The silence of the cabin was so profound that he could hear the sound of his own eyelids sliding over his eyes. It was a sound like the rustling of paper. He closed them. In the darkness, he saw the road again. It was a white ribbon, endless and winding, cutting through a forest of black trees. He saw himself riding, a small figure in a vast landscape. He felt the rhythm of the horse, the crunch of the snow, the bite of the wind. It was a memory that felt more real than the room he was in. He felt the weight of the satchel on his back. He felt the cold in his bones. He was the road. He was the journey. He snapped his eyes open. The fire had flared up, the new log having finally been fully claimed by the flames. The room was brighter for a moment, the light reaching far enough to illuminate the overturned bench in the corner. He looked at it, his mind processing the shape. It was more wood. It was more time. He felt a sense of relief, a loosening of the knot of anxiety in his chest. He would not run out. He would last until the dawn, even if the dawn never came. He looked at his hands. They were covered in soot and gray ash, the skin dry and cracked. He rubbed them together, the sound a dry rasp in the quiet. He was becoming the fire. He was being consumed by the process of survival, his skin turning to ash, his breath turning to smoke. He felt a strange detachment from his own body, as if he were a ghost haunting the man by the hearth. He watched the man move, watched him breathe, watched him stare into the flames. The wind hit the side of the cabin with a sudden, violent force, a gust that made the timbers groan. A fine dust of snow was forced through a gap in the chinking, drifting down through the air like frozen glitter before vanishing in the heat of the fire. The messenger watched it fall, fascinated by the brief, sparkling life of the flakes. They were travelers like him. They had come from the dark, lived for a second in the light, and were gone. He checked the time, not by a clock, but by the level of the oil in the lamp he had lit earlier. It was nearly gone, the wick drawing up the last dregs of the fuel. The flame was small and blue, flickering at the bottom of the glass chimney. He watched it die. It gave a final, bright flare, a last gasp of energy, and then it was gone. The darkness in the room rushed in, reclaiming the corners, narrowing the world down to the glowing rectangle of the hearth. He didn't mind. The fire was enough. The fire was all he needed. He sat in the orange-tinged gloom, a silhouette against the stones. The visual scene was now a study in minimalism. The red-orange glow of the coals, the dark shape of the man, the black void of the room. It was a scene from a forgotten history, a primal image of man and fire against the night. The strokes of the drawing were heavy and thick, capturing the density of the atmosphere and the weight of the cold. There was no movement, only the slow, internal pulse of the embers. He felt the cold from the wall beginning to penetrate his back again. He shifted forward, away from the logs, hunching his shoulders. He was a small, compact ball of heat, trying to keep the core of his life from cooling. He focused on his breathing. In, the dry, smoky air. Out, the warm, moist breath. It was a cycle of exchange. He was feeding the room with his life, and the fire was feeding him with its heat. He looked at the remaining pieces of the table. There wasn't much left. A few shards of the top, the last of the legs. He would have to start on the bench soon. He pictured the bench in his mind, the long, sturdy seat, the 4 legs. It would be hard to break without a proper axe swing, and he was too tired to stand. He would have to do it from the floor, using the weight of the axe head like a hammer. The thought of the labor was exhausting. He decided to wait. He would burn the table, until there was nothing left but the shadow of it. He listened for the horse. The silence from the linta was absolute. He imagined the snow piling up against the side of the animal, the wind scouring the blanket. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness. The horse was his only companion, the only other living thing in this frozen world. The silence felt like an absence, a hole in the night. He wanted to call out to make a sound, but his voice was gone, buried under layers of ash and smoke. He returned his gaze to the fire. The block of oak was now a glowing sculpture of light. It was beautiful in its destruction, a temple of heat that was slowly crumbling. He watched a crack form in the center, a widening canyon of fire that revealed the intense, white-hot core. He felt the heat on his eyes, a dry, stinging sensation. He didn't look away. The fire was the only thing worth seeing. The wind moaned in the chimney, a low, mournful note that sounded like a name being called from a great distance. The messenger did not answer. He was no longer the man who had a name. He was the watcher. He was the keeper. He was the survivor. He sat in the darkness, a figure of stone and wool, waiting for the wood to turn to ash, waiting for the night to end, waiting for the fire to tell him what to do next. The visual scene held steady, a dark, heavy tableau of silent endurance in the deep, freezing heart of the winter. The fire was no longer a spectacle of flame, but a concentrated furnace of glowing embers, a deep, resonant orange that seemed to pull the very air of the room into its core. The last structural piece of the table leg, the heavy knotted base that had once anchored the furniture to the floor, had finally succumbed to the heat. It lay in the center of the grate, a block of incandescent carbon, pulsing with a slow, internal light that flared and faded with the rhythm of a dying star. The wood had been stripped of its identity, its grain and its history burned away, leaving behind only the pure, primal energy of the oak. The visual landscape of the cabin was now almost entirely reclaimed by the dark. The amber light from the hearth was a shallow pool, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the floorboards like the fingers of a reaching hand. The walls had vanished into a velvety, indigo void, the texture of the logs replaced by a granular blackness that felt heavy and thick. The messenger was a study in chiaroscuro, his profile etched in sharp, warm light against a background of absolute shadow. The wool of his tunic was a landscape of orange highlights and deep, navy blue hollows, the fibers catching the glow in a way that made him look as if he were carved from the earth itself. He felt the silence of the room as a physical weight, a pressure that pressed against his temples and filled his ears with a dull, ringing tone. It was a silence that had been accumulating for decades, a static layer of time that was only disturbed by the occasional metallic tink of a cooling stone or the soft, powdery collapse of a bit of ash. Outside, the wind had lost its sharpness, settling into a low, mournful groan that sounded like the earth shifting in its sleep. The snow was now a solid barrier, a white wall that had climbed halfway up the door, sealing the messenger into his stone and timber cocoon. He was no longer in a building. He was in a hollowed-out space within the winter, a pocket of warmth in a world of solid ice. His exhaustion had passed beyond the stage of tiredness into a state of crystalline clarity. He felt every hair on his arms, every fold of the fabric against his skin, every breath as it traveled through his throat. His mind was a quiet room, empty of everything but the fire. He was not thinking of the king, or the road, or the messages. He was merely observing the entropy of the wood. He watched a single, glowing coal detach itself from the main body and roll toward the edge of the hearth. He tracked its movement with the focus of a hawk, watching the trail of tiny sparks it left behind on the stone. It came to rest against a cold ash pile, its bright orange fading slowly to a dull, bruised red, and finally to a lightless gray. He reached for the next piece of fuel. His movements were slow, fluid, like a man moving under deep water. He took a shard of the tabletop, a flat, heavy piece of oak that was still cool and dry. He held it in his lap for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, the hardness of the seasoned timber. It was the second to last piece of the table. Beyond this lay only the bench and the bunk. He was dismantling his sanctuary to preserve his life, a slow, methodical consumption of the very things that define the room as a human space. He was turning architecture into atmosphere. He placed the wood on the embers. The sound was a soft, dry scrape. He did not watch it ignite. He knew the cycle by heart now. First the smoke, thick and acrid, then the blackening of the grain, then the sudden blue flare of the gases catching, and finally the steady orange consumption. He leaned back against the wall, his head thumping softly against the log. The cold from the wood was sharp now, a needle that pierced through his layers of wool and bit into his shoulder blade. He did not move. He accepted the cold as a boundary, a reminder of where he ended and the world began. The smoke in the room was a heavy, stagnant layer that hung just above his head. In the dim light, it looked like a suspended ocean of charcoal gray silk, undulating slowly in the convection currents of the fire. He watched the way it swirled, the patterns it made, complex and unrepeatable. It was a language he couldn't read, a story written in soot and air. He breathed it in, the scent of the fire filling his lungs, warming him from the inside. He felt his pulse, a slow, heavy thud in his neck, a drumbeat for a funeral that hadn't happened yet. He thought of the satchel. It was almost invisible now, a darker shadow among shadows on the floor. He reached out a hand, his fingers finding the cool leather. It felt like the skin of a dead animal. He wondered if the letters inside were still dry. He pictured the ink, frozen on the page in intricate, brittle patterns of black. He wondered if the messages would ever be read or if they would remain here, buried in the snow, a secret for the future to find. It didn't seem to matter. The act of carrying them was what defined him, not the destination. He was a messenger, even if the message was never delivered. He was a link in a chain that had broken, but he held his end with a stubborn, frozen grip. The visual style of the scene was one of extreme stillness. The messenger sat like a statue of wool and leather, his eyes fixed on the point where the new wood met the old fire. The drawing was rendered in heavy, textured strokes, capturing the rough grain of the floor, the soot on the stones, the frayed edges of the messenger's cloak. The colors were muted and heavy, burnt sienna, deep indigo, slate gray, and the piercing, singular orange of the hearth. There were no edges, only gradients of shadow, a world losing its definition in the long, cold night. He heard a sound. It was not the wind and it was not the fire. It was a low, rhythmic thudding from the lean-to, the horse. The animal was kicking at the wall, a dull, muffled sound of hoof on wood. It was a slow, deliberate movement, a signal of distress or perhaps just a refusal to be still. The messenger closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm. Thud, pause, thud, pause. It sounded like a clock counting down the hours. He felt a sharp, cold pang of grief in his chest. He was here by the warmth and the beast was out there, fighting the freeze in the dark. He wanted to go to it, to stand in the snow and hold the animal's head, to share the heat of his own body. But he remained seated. The cold was too deep, the snow was too high, and the fire was too fragile. He was a prisoner of his own survival. He looked at his hands. They were covered in a fine layer of gray ash, the skin looking like old parchment. He rubbed them together and the dust fell away in a soft, silent cloud. He was becoming part of the hearth, a mineral thing. He felt a strange peace in the thought. The struggle was over, there was only the endurance. The fire would burn, the wood would vanish, and the dawn would come, or it wouldn't. He was a small, quiet figure in a vast, loud winter, and he was content to be forgotten. He picked up a small splinter from the floor, a tiny shard no bigger than a needle. He held it up to the firelight, watching the orange glow through the translucent edges of the wood. He broke it between his fingers, the sound a microscopic snap. He tossed it into the coals and watched it vanish. Dust to dust, he thought, wood to ash, messenger to shadow. The fire flared as the new piece of the tabletop finally caught, a bright, yellow tongue of flame licking up toward the chimney. For a second, the room was illuminated, revealing the empty wood box, the shattered remains of the table, and the heavy, iron bolt on the door. Then the flames settled, the light retracted, and the shadows rushed back in, thicker and heavier than before. The messenger adjusted his scarf, pulling the wool up to his eyes, and waited for the next breath of the storm. The fire had reached its final, most concentrated form. The last heavy slab of the oak tabletop had disintegrated, leaving behind a glowing cairn of coals that occupied the center of the hearth like a pile of fallen stars. There were no more flames, only the intense, vibrating radiance of the embers, a deep and resonant crimson that seemed to pulse in time with the messenger's own slowing heartbeat. The heat was no longer a wave. It was a steady, dry presence that filled the small space between the man and the stones, a final reservoir of energy extracted from the ghost of the forest. The white ash was thick now, a soft and silent shroud that covered the glowing core, muffling the last gasps of the combustion. The visual atmosphere of the room was a masterpiece of shadow and terminal light. The indigo darkness was absolute in the corners, a heavy, charcoal density that had swallowed the bunk, the empty woodbox, and the far reaches of the ceiling. Only the area immediately surrounding the hearth remained visible, rendered in the soft, grainy textures of a pastel drawing on dark paper. The messenger was a silhouette of worn wool and weathered leather, his form defined by a thin, amber rim of light that traced the curve of his hood and the line of his shoulder. The air was thick with the scent of the dying fire, the sweet, heavy smell of oak ash, and the metallic tang of a cooling hearth. He sat perfectly still, his back against the frozen logs, his hands resting on his knees. He felt the cold of the cabin wall as a familiar, unyielding companion, a pressure that was no longer painful, but merely a fact of his geography. The balance of the room had shifted. The cold was winning, reclaiming the territory it had lost during the hours of the fire's strength. He could feel the frost creeping across the floorboards, a slow and silent tide that moved toward his boots. He did not move to meet it. He remained in his place, a sentinel at the edge of the world, watching the light retreat. He reached into the satchel one last time. His fingers, stiff and slow, found the texture of the parchment. He did not pull the letters out. He merely felt the weight of them, the crisp edges of the paper, the hardness of the wax seals. They were cold now, having lost the warmth of his body. They were once again just objects, bundles of intent and ink that were waiting for a future that seemed increasingly abstract. He felt a profound sense of completion. He had carried them through the iron sky and the serpentine snow. He had brought them to the last stop. Whether they moved further was no longer his concern. He had fulfilled the contract of the road. The silence of the night had reached a state of perfection. The wind had finally died down, leaving behind a world that was utterly motionless. There was no more groaning from the timbers, no more rattling of the latch. The snow had buried the cabin to the eaves, creating a total acoustic seal against the universe. The only sound was the microscopic tink of the cooling embers and the slow, rhythmic rasp of his own breathing. It was a pressurized silence, a heavy vacuum that felt as if it were trying to draw the soul out of his body. He looked at the empty floor where the table had once stood. The room was hollowed out, stripped of its utility, reduced to the bare essentials of shelter. He had consumed the furniture of his trade to buy these hours of heat. It was a fair exchange. He thought of the men who would come after him, the messengers of the spring who would find the cabin empty, the woodbox bare, and the hearth filled with the gray ash of an oak table. They would understand. They would see the charcoal marks on the floor and the missing legs of the bench, and they would know the story of the long night. A movement from the linta broke the stillness. It was not a kick this time, but a long, low nuzzle against the exterior wall. The horse was still there. The messenger closed his eyes and leaned his head against the logs, feeling the vibration of the animal's presence. The beast was alive, huddling against the timber, its endurance outlasting the fire. He felt a wave of gratitude for the shaggy, silent creature, the partner that had carried him through the gray void. They were two halves of a single unit of survival, resting now in the belly of the winter. The visual scene began to fade as the embers dimmed. The deep crimson of the coals shifted toward a bruised purple, then to a dull, lightless gray. The sphere of visibility shrank, pulling back from the floorboards, withdrawing from the messenger's knees, until only the rough texture of the hearthstone remained. The drawing was being erased, stroke by stroke, by the encroaching blackness. The messenger watched the last point of light, a single, stubborn spark in a crevice of ash. It flared briefly, a microscopic sun, and then vanished. He was in total darkness now. It was a heavy, velvety black that felt like water. He did not feel fear. He felt only the immense weight of his own fatigue. He adjusted his cloak, wrapping it tighter around his chest, and lowered his chin into the wool of his scarf. The air was cold, but the core of his body was still warm, a banked fire of his own. He would wait here in the silence of the buried station, for the first gray light to filter through the snow-clogged chimney. He would wait for the sun to reclaim the iron sky. His mind drifted into a state of suspended animation, a loop of memory and sensation. He was riding again, the horse moving with a hypnotic rhythm through the pines. The snow was falling, soft and silent, blurring the edges of the world. He felt the weight of the satchel. He felt the bite of the wind. He was the royal messenger, and he was almost home. The road was long and the fire was dying, but the journey was a circle that never truly ended.